on Maqāṣid al-Sharīʿa here at American Journal of Islam and Society, and hosted by International Institute of Islamic Thought. Today, Tuesday, May 4th, we have three presenters. Rizart Bayyah, soon to be Dr. Rizart Bayyah, inshallah, David Drennan, and Yumna Helmi. Let me introduce them one by one, and then we'll go in that order. Rizart Bayyah holds a master's in the study of contemporary Muslim thought and societies, summa cum laude from Hamad bin Khalifa University, Doha, in Qatar. And he is now a doctoral student and doctor of philosophy in the PhD program in Arabic and Islamic Studies at Georgetown University, where I have the honor of serving on his PhD committee. He has published many articles in a number of peer-reviewed academic journals and translated many others into his native language, Albanian. He is much more than what his humble introduction says here. He, in fact, has been also a dear friend, and I remember him very graciously volunteering to read the entirety of my translation of Madarij al-Salikin, and checking the English against the Arabic, all 2,000 pages voluntarily, and doing so with incredible accuracy. So, and he also maintains a very important website in Albanian and has published many things. So Rizart, it's great to have you. David Drennan's research is focused on Islamic legal thought and text in their socio-historical context. In particular, he investigates use and understanding of the aims and objectives of Islamic law, Maqāṣid al-Shari'a, alongside the notion of general interest, benefit, maslaha, and how these concepts interact in the realm of juristic opinions, fatwas, covering real cases. So, great to have you, David Drennan. Yumna Helmi is a teaching associate at the University of Cambridge. She holds an MA degree in educational leadership at the University of Hull. Her master's dissertation examined the influence of Islamic values on leadership practices at Islamic institutions in the UK. She's interested in social Islamic thought and ethics within the field of Hadith and Quranic studies. She has extensive experience in teaching all levels of Arabic language, philosophy, and Islamic thought in the UK and the UAE. She taught and developed a range of courses, including Tafsir, Hadith, Islamic law, Salafism, Arabic context, morphology, Quranic Arabic, and spoken Arabic. Welcome, Yumna Helmi. So we'll start in that order. Rizart Bayyah, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Ovim. Thank you for your wonderful words. It has been a pleasure being able to help you and knowing you and benefiting from your wide knowledge. Thank you very much to Triple IT and to the American Journal of Islamic Studies for allowing me to be here today and to speak, and for all the people who are present and hearing us now. I would like to put some PowerPoints. Just a sec. Then they should be here. Wait. Okay. Hopefully you are able to see it now, the PowerPoint. So my talk will be on Abdullah bin Bayyah and his view of tajdeed in usul al-fiqh. Now, usul al-fiqh has been, the tajdeed, the renewal of usul al-fiqh has been a topic that has been widely shared in the contemporary Islamic thought, and many people have offered different proposals of renewal of usul al-fiqh. And Abdullah bin Bayyah is an important voice of contemporary Islamic thought, and he has written.
Sorry if I could interrupt you. I only see part of your screen.
Okay. Do you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry for the interruption. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. So Abdullah bin Bayyah is an important voice added to a number of scholars who have tried to give life to usul al-fiqh and to make it more respondent to modern contemporary needs of the Muslim community. And I would like today to just present his thought and his proposal view on the tajdeed of usul al-fiqh. First of all, bin Bayyah gives a kind of summary of idea of the different proposals that have been put forward towards usul al-fiqh. And according to him, the proposals of renewal in usul al-fiqh has been various. One of them has been the call to simplify the very material or substance, al-madda of usul al-fiqh. The second proposal has been the attempt to trim or alleviate usul al-fiqh from the perceived unnecessary parts like logic and kalam. Parts of it is also the attempt to simplify the terminology of usul al-fiqh and render it more modern, if we can say like this. And the third type of attempt is to surpass the conditions stipulated in the usul al-fiqh in determining the efficient cause, al-illah, and relying only on wisdom and maslahah. Now, bin Bayyah recognizes the benefit of some of these calls, but he considers them that they lack objectives and clarity, and they do not bring substantive changes or dynamics to the usul al-fiqh. He, in the meantime, highlights three other proposals of renewal of usul al-fiqh that, according to him, are a danger to Sharia and to the way Islamic law functions. And those are the call to rely on hikmah and maslahah, unrestricted by any determinants, dawabit, of ta'leel, or by any of the instruments of applying the legal norms. The second type is the call to rely on maqāṣid, devoid from any usuli consideration and divested from any considerations of particular indicators, dala'il. And the third is the call for the historicization and contextualization of the Shariatic text, a kind of progressive hermeneutics, if we can say like this. And according to bin Bayyah, all of these claims of tajdeed are a threat, as I said, to the eternal validity of the Shariatic text, because they do not take usul into consideration and they do not bring maqāṣid and usul in a symbiotic relationship with each other. He himself posits his proposal of renewal in the, let's say, in a kind of traditionalist mode. The idea is that, as we will see, and I will explain, for bin Bayyah, the substance of usul al-fiqh does not need to change. So he is against any revisionist or a kind of modernist, progressist idea of tajdeed, of renewal. In his view, it is only working with the surah of usul al-fiqh, with the form, and shaping the different aspect of already recognized framework of usul al-fiqh that we can bring changes to the very nature or to the very structure of usul al-fiqh. So what he explains is that instead of abandoning the existing usuli frameworks in favor of a revisionist or a modernist reconstruction of usul al-fiqh, what he aims in his project of renewal, that I will explain shortly, is that he seeks adjustments and reform through arranging the already recognized aspect of usul al-fiqh in a different form. So through working through form, he tries to bring new divisions or exceptions or distinctions, or expand or restrict the scope of traditional usuli frameworks. And in a moment, you will realize what does he really mean by this. But first of all, before starting, I would like to highlight the fact that for bin Bayyah, there is an important aspect of his usul project of renewal of usul al-fiqh. So what he does is that he equates maslahah or maqāṣid with istidlal, and tries to reconstruct the history of usul al-fiqh in a way that incorporates maslahah and maqāṣid, and in a way that makes maslahah and maqāṣid foundational for the understanding at the beginning genealogy of usul al-fiqh. So what do I mean by this is that in his reconstruction of usul al-fiqh history, Bayyah presents the development of the science of usul al-fiqh as the attempt to strike a balance between text and istidlal, between nas and istidlal, inference. So istidlal normally refer to all the, let's say, non-textual considerations and framework of usul al-fiqh like istislah, public welfare, sadd al-dhara'a, eliminating the pretext, or istihsan, Jewish preference, etc. Now, given that the istidlali consideration, according to Bayyah, constitute an attempt to reason beyond the text or to understand the textual sources in the light of their intended meaning, this means that istidlal is in reality a search for the maslaha or maqāṣid. Now, this equation of the maqāṣid with istidlal, or this interlink between them, allows Bayyah to speak about a maqāṣidi approach or a maqāṣidi school of thought from the time of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. So from the time of the Sahaba. So what he does is that he mentioned that he takes the ijtihad of the Sahaba, like, for example, Abu Bakr's decision to fight as apostates the Arab tribes that refused to pay zakat, or his decision to collect the Quran in one mushaf, or appoint the next caliph after him, or Umar bin Khattab refused to apply the had punishment for theft during the time of famine. He interprets all the ijtihad of the Sahaba that goes beyond the, let's say, plain meaning of the text as instances of ijtihad based on istidlal. And because it is based on istidlal, it is also based on the maqāṣidi reasoning. And in his view, the start of usul al-fiqh, which is ijtihad of Sahaba and the attempt to understand the textual sources, is also the start of maqāṣid itself. And this kind of ijtihad through maqāṣid or istidlali aspect of the ijtihad of the companions was passed to the followers, to the tabi'een, and is represented by the school of Ahl al-Madinah, which later on passed to Imam Malik and to his emphasis of sadd al-dhara'a and istislah, etc. And for Bayyah, also the attempt to strike a balance between text and istidlal and to see beyond the text to try to figure out the legal norms on different specific situations is also at the foundation of the formation of the schools of Islamic law. In his view, he presents the Imam Shafi'i and his negative stance against istihsan and sadd al-dhara'a and other aspect of istidlal as the originator and the initiator of the debate on maqāṣid. And the other schools of law, which took a more istidlali aspect, instead of Shafi'i that took a more textual approach towards Islamic law, the attempt of the other schools of law to reply to the Shafi'i school and to find legitimacy for the istidlali aspect for the istihsan, istislah, and other istidlali aspects, this attempt, which was initiated by the negative aspect of Imam Shafi'i, is actually the heart of the beginning of the Maqāṣid, of the continuation of the Maqāṣid school of law. So in the reconstruction of Islamic, of Usul al-Fiqh, Bayyah paradoxically makes Imam Shafi'i the initiator and the forerunner of the Maqāṣid approach. And in his view, the theory of Maqāṣid emerged as a necessary legal framework that provided the required criteria and boundaries for istidlal. So somehow Maqāṣid make the istidlal a recognizable and acceptable usuli framework. And in Bayyah's narrative, the history of usul al-fiqh becomes the history of Maqāṣid itself. And this reconstruction of the history of Islamic law allows him to ground the legitimacy of Maqāṣid approach, to ground it in the legitimacy of usul fiqh itself. And later on, the Maqāṣidi approach continued with the idea of tahsin wa taqbih, the good and the repellent, and other notions. But the equation of Maqāṣid with istidlal is important for his project of tajdeed. Then, because in Bayyah's view, and now I enter more in his theory actually, Bin Bayyah, in laying out the structure of his project, he draws from the Aristotelian theory of causation, the material, the formal, the efficient, and the final cause. Known in Islamic logic as al-ilal al-arba', the four form of causation, Bin Bayyah conceived this form as the only means through which scholars can realize change and provide explanation for things. In his view, the material, the madda of usul al-fiqh, is not susceptible to change or reform. It is the realm of the formal, a surah, i.e. the form which through its shape makes the matter responsible towards a specific function, that most of the tajdeed in usul al-fiqh takes place. The role of Maqāṣid deliberations appears predominantly in the element of tarkib, which is a part of the surah, which means the structuring. That for Bin Bayyah consists in the assembling or putting together the parts of a compound reality. By this, he means the construction of the universals from its particulars, and vice versa. Also, the structuring of two particulars by putting them in relation with each other. Now, in a broader perspective, okay, this will come a little bit later. So, in a broader perspective, Bin Bayyah assigns the role of formal causation in usul al-fiqh as manifested in three major legal aspects that constitute the heart of usul fiqh itself, which is ijtihad fi dalalat al-alfaz, ijtihad in the linguistic indicators, ijtihad through maqāṣid, and the third is ijtihad through tahqiq al-manat, verification of the hinge. For Bin Bayyah, the role of the surah is crucial in bringing the necessary tajdeed in all the above mentioned types of ijtihad. And he dedicates one book to each of them, actually. But he restricts the role of maqāṣid mainly on the second kind of ijtihad. More precisely, Bin Bayyah situates the role of maqāṣid in the renewal of usul al-fiqh within what he calls manzūmatu ta'līl, within the system of ratiocination, of the system of ta'līl, if we can say it like this. Now, within this system, he ascribes to maqāṣid the principal role of enabling the construction of universals and preserving the balance between universals and the particulars. That's the main role of maqāṣid. For him, maqāṣid considerations can be crucial also in expanding the reach and the scope of the system of ta'līl. In this context, for Bin Bayyah, any process of ta'līl should be based on two muqaddimah, or preludes, or I don't know how we can translate that, that these two muqaddimah should precede any thinking on ta'līl or any thinking on qiyas, etc. And all of them, of these two muqaddimas, pertain to the domain of maqāṣid. The first is taking into consideration the logicality of usul al-fiqh. Here, the role of logical demonstration, burhan, is crucial. Bin Bayyah conceives the universality and the certainty of the premises of syllogistic analogy as important for expanding the understanding of the juristic and inductive analogy. And the second muqaddimah is considering the objectives of Sharia, universal or particular, original or dependent, etc. Now, I will expand more on these muqaddimas so that we can understand better what he means by that. So, regarding the first muqaddimah, Bin Bayyah emphasized the importance of logical demonstration for usul al-fiqh. In his view, the syllogistic analogy, qiyas al-shumuli, can serve to assess the correctness and the epistemic validity of the conclusions reached by juristic analogy and plays an essential role in rearranging and refining the proofs of usul, as well as testing the validity of some of its framework for the modern condition. Now, the crucial role of logic within usul for Bin Bayyah resides in its ability to structure the legal maxims and arrange its proofs in order to make them suitable for the expected results. In Bin Bayyah's view, the role of logic in creating or refining concepts and determining the contents in order to build new frameworks or test the readiness of old frameworks is essential. Now, the role of maqāṣid here is that being the incubator of the universals, maqāṣids are particularly important for the syllogistic analogy, which in itself is a form of analogy from a universal to a particular, and which is relevant to other types of juristic analogy. Now, Bin Bayyah expands the role of ta'līl not only on qiyas, juristic qiyas and inductive qiyas, but another form of qiyas like qiyas dalala, al-aqs, shibh, etc., as well as in تحقيق المناط, the verification of the hinge, تخريج and تحقيق المناط, and all of these qiyas analogies needs Maqāṣid consideration to work properly, and needs Maqāṣid consideration beforehand in order to be fruitful in their results. Now, an essential part of expanding the role of ta'lil through Maqāṣid for Ibn Bayyah is that Maqāṣid are a crucial part of ijtihad fil illah, in the ratio legis. The Maqāṣid appears particularly relevant for ta'lil bil kulli, as it says, ratiocination through universal or by universals. Now, the unattested maslaha, for example, or unattested suitability falls under this category of ta'lil. The latter, munasib al-mursala, unattested suitability, consists in the attachment by the mere presence of maslaha without any attestation from a specific textual foundation. In this case, it is as if maslaha has become a special effective cause in itself. This cannot be called, strictly speaking, juridical analogy, because it does not consist in carrying a hidden particular to a more manifest particular as a consequence of a common effective cause between them. In the case of ijtihad by unattested maslaha or suitability, we are in front of a form of ta'lil consisting in the istidlal of a particular from a universal in according to specific conditions. Whereas the second muqaddimah, regarding that, Ibn Bayyah argues that Maqāṣid constitutes the natural environment of the efficient cause. Most of the efficient causes are Maqāṣid itself. For him, for Ibn Bayyah, the activation of usul al-fiqh in the light of Maqāṣid, so taf'il al-usul al-fiqh, in the light of Maqāṣid, serves as a way to expand the capacity of istidlal and as a muqaddimah to ma'qul al-nas. The same way as linguistics, mabahith al-lughawiyya, serve as a prelude or a muqaddimah to the dalalat al-alfaz, signification of expressions. This role of Maqāṣid in tajdeed for Ibn Bayyah is mainly based on two elements. First, the activation of usul al-fiqh in the light of Maqāṣid. And second, taking into consideration the principle of mutual attraction between the universal and the particular. Now, these two last elements are important, and this is why I want to explain them going near to the conclusion also, is that for Ibn Bayyah, activating usul al-fiqh in the light of Maqāṣid is necessary to expand the role of four usuli circles, or four usuli dawa'ir, as he calls them. And they are the core of istidlal. So Maqāṣid is important to expand the core of istidlal. Those are the istihsan, istislah, the deduction of legal analogies, istinbad al-akisa, and taking into consideration the anticipation, ma'adat, and the means and the raya of legal injunctions. Now, in usul al-fiqh terms, for Ibn Bayyah, employing Maqāṣid in the structure of usul al-fiqh in these four circles means that sometimes the meaning of a Maqāṣid might take a meaning of a particular, i.e. that of attaching a new case to a particular original case in a specific locus, and this constitutes the normal qiyas. Some other times, the integration of Maqāṣid means that to bring into the existence a legal norm based solely on a universal, in the cases where no particular case exists for the issue under analysis, and this is istislah. And other times, Maqāṣid consideration might require the exemption of a particular from its established universal, based on a specific feature of the particular that requires such exemption. And this is istihsan. And lastly, the Maqāṣid deliberation might require changing the outward meaning of a legal injunctions in light of an anticipation of its effects. And this is the sad al-dhara'a. Regarding the second aspect, Ibn Bayyah highlights the mutual relationship between the universals and the particulars, and the way they should be considered as in a mutual interaction between them. After quoting Shatibi and his emphasis on the harmony between universals and particulars, Ibn Bayyah says that when a particular and universal clash with each other, it is obligatory for the mujtahid to reconcile them. And in case this is not possible, then neither the universal nor the particular should be preferred over the other in an unqualified way. The reason for this resides in the possibility that the mujtahid might realize the particular a specific meaning that makes it stand alone from the universal and take another legal norms different from that dictated by the universal. For bin Bayyah, this is the heart of istihsan, which means the exclusion of a particular from a universal. Also, saddu dhara' constitutes another case where, in the light of the anticipated effects, the particular takes the place of a universal and the legal norm is given following the dictates of the particular. Other time, as in the case of unattested maslaha, the particular is divested of all the meanings and is absorbed and controlled by the universal. All these possible scenarios are left to the careful, rational, and textual consideration of mujtahid, but all of them require a maqāṣidi understanding of the relationship between the universal, which is the domain of the maqāṣid, and the particular. And as a conclusion, bin Bayyah, during his analysis, have argued that maqāṣid are important not only for they are important for the manzuma to ta'lil, and they can serve as a muqaddimah for any kind of ta'lil, and can reach and expand the scope of ta'lil. But he argues more than that. In his view, maqāṣid are also part of all the chapters of the usul al-fiqh. And without the maqāṣid, usul al-fiqh is deficient, whereas without maqāṣid, without usuli consideration, maqāṣid are ineffective and fruitless. Now, what he argues here is that maqāṣid are not only embedded in the very fabric of usul al-fiqh, but they are the heart of usul al-fiqh. And the relation of maqāṣid with usul al-fiqh resembles that of the spirit with the body. And this is a bold claim. Now, bin Bayyah offers more than 30 ways that are beyond the manzumat al-ta'lil per se, more than 30 examples or more than 30 ways in which maqāṣid are blended in the text of usul al-fiqh, are necessary for its sound functioning, and are actually the heart of usul al-fiqh. Now, we do not have the time to go through all of them. I just will mention 3 or 4 examples, and then that's it. So the first, for example, is the first case that you mentioned is when a general text is specified by a maqāṣid. So maqāṣid specify a general text. This is, for example, the case of the Maliki school of thought, where the menstruating women that exempt the menstruating women from the general prohibition of touching the Quran while she is in a state of impurity. This exemption is based on istihsan, because the application of the original legal norms to the menstruating women would render difficult for her to resemble the remembrance of the Quran and its memorization. Another case is the elucidation of an ambiguous expression, mujmal, through a maqāṣidi meaning. For example, the Hanafis have understood the ambiguous term qur'u as menstruation. This is based on the understanding that waiting period of a woman has been legislated for the purpose of ensuring that a woman is not pregnant, and menstruation is a sign that confirms this fact. Another example, for example, is the origination of the legal norms about which there is no considered suitability. This is what is known as the unattested suitability that refers back to the unattested maslaha. An illustration of this is the creation of the establishment of prison system by the Caliph Umar ibn Abdul Aziz as a deterrence from criminals. Now, I see that time is running a little bit, so I'm not going to mention the 4th and the 5th case. But as you see, the 4th case is making preponderance between the 2 general texts in the light of maqāṣid, or relying on maqāṣid to preserve the blocking of the means. And bin Bayyah goes like this for 30 ways that for him proves that maqāṣid are the heart of usul al-fiqh. Now, the ways, the interconnection between maqāṣid and usul al-fiqh that bin Bayyah demonstrate the inseparability and mutual relation between the 2 domains of law. The ways articulated by bin Bayyah are indeed a strong argument for the intermingling of maqāṣid with usul al-fiqh. And bin Bayyah has done a tremendous service to the debate on this issue by proposing and articulating them. The cases mentioned by bin Bayyah demonstrate the insufficiency and the strictly linguistic or textual considerations in understanding the correct legal judgment for particular cases. However, in my view, A closer look at the examples presented shows that the invocation of Maqāṣid considerations come into play only when strictly usuli deliberations fail to provide the sound legal outcome. The linguistic and textual consideration appear to be still the central usuli way to arrive at the correct inference of legal norms from textual sources. The Maqāṣid factor, although it is part of usul al-fiqh, seems still an auxiliary dimension mobilized by the mujtahid to provide legal clarity for cases whose legal meaning cannot be grasped by strictly usuli analysis. Bin Bayyah claimed that the above-mentioned cases prove that Maqāṣid are the heart of usul al-fiqh, and that Maqāṣid are to usul like the soul to the body, seems to me to be slightly far-fetched or unjustified. This was pretty much what the project of Bin Bayyah constituted, is the role of Maqāṣid in the history of usul al-fiqh, the role of Maqāṣid in the system of ta'leel, and the role of Maqāṣid generally as central to the usuli ijtihad. Thank you very much.
Oh, very well done, Rizat, and thank you very much for an extremely well done and very well-packed presentation of a very a complex topic. Our commentator today is Yusuf Sufi. You have 10 minutes. The floor is yours. Please take it away.
Thank you, Overmir. Thank you for your paper, Razart. Your paper seeks to flesh out the discourse of Maqāṣid within Abdullah bin Bayyah's Usul al-Fiqh. You present bin Bayyah's ideas in detail in order to show that he sees Maqāṣid at the very heart of historical Islamic legal theory. But you also offer a critique of bin Bayyah's theory through the examples that he gives. These examples, you suggest, do not place the Maqāṣid at the heart of the jurist's ijtihad. Now here, I'm not sure I agree with you. It's true that we don't have an example of a text where the nas or the dhahir meaning of the text, the perspicuous or apparent meaning of the text is shown to be in line with a maqsad. But I would suggest that this is because when the textual evidence overlaps with an obvious maqsad, there's little need to overthink the issue. For instance, if a text notes that wine use is prohibited and the jurist and society in general sees wine as harmful to humans, there's little need to debate the text much further. In contrast, for cases where there's a rejection of a nas, as in the example that you give of Aisha's rejection of a prophetic report, or in the reinterpretation of a text that is apparent, dhahir, like when you give the reinterpretation of the two sellers, mutabayyi'an. In such a situation, there seems to be a necessity to bring in a maqsad or a maqasidi approach to say, okay, there's an apparent meaning, or we think there's a clear meaning, but in reality, our intuitions are wrong here. Your second critique is that the exercise of maqasidi deliberations, and I'm quoting you here, seems to be left to the rational discretion and subjective evaluation of the mujtahid. I get this point and I agree with it. But this might be more a problem of not understanding the role of usul al-fiqh than of bin Bayyah's failure to flesh out a proper maqasidi theory of usul al-fiqh. Within both the academy, so let me flesh out what I mean by a failure of understanding usul al-fiqh. Within both the academy and Muslim communities, usul al-fiqh is often labeled a methodology, which gives you the impression that if you master books of usul al-fiqh, then you understand how the law should work. But as Sherman Jackson pointed out 2 decades ago in his article, Fiction and Formalism, usul al-fiqh is too indeterminate to serve as a methodology. Moreover, jurists of the 10th and 11th centuries, such as al-Qadi Abu Ya'la, would critique those who thought that mastering usul al-fiqh made you competent in substantive law. Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi, for his part, an 11th century Shafi, thought that the opinion of an usuli that did not study, of an usuli who wasn't also a master of the furu, should not be considered as part of ijma'. So usul al-fiqh was never supposed to offer standalone methodology. Rather, usul al-fiqh is supposed to provide evidence for why the law is constituted of a set of sources, like the hadith, for instance. Why is the hadith a source of law? And to answer questions about their proper use. Usul al-fiqh's relevance depends on a living tradition of substantive legal debates, where jurists debate the potential specific proof, the dalil mu'ayyan, for the law. In short, I don't think it's fair to be critical of Bin Bayyah's following in the footsteps of past usulis by not providing full clarity on how a jurist is supposed to go about assessing a textual proof in light of the general maqāṣid. Just to step back from what I'm saying, no classical text of usul al-fiqh says step one, a jurist must do this, step two, a jurist must do that. Instead, it's dealing with specific sources of the law and topics relevant to those sources of the law. So I think that the work of showing the relationship between the specific and the maqāṣid should be done through a process of mutual critique, where jurists debate concretely how particular texts or particular qiyas ought to be interpreted. I presume that Bin Bayyah has been part of such discussions through the issuing of fatwas, but you can tell us more on the subject. Another point that might be of use for you is to think about whether Bin Bayyah's historical tracing of the maqāṣid within usul al-fiqh is accurate. You note that Bin Bayyah credits a Shafi for centering the text in Islamic legal theory, and he credits Shafi's critics for creating an usul al-fiqh framework that incorporates maqāṣid notions such as istislah and istihsan. Thus, according to Bin Bayyah, the Shafis are somewhat outliers in their commitment to textuality because of their commitment to textuality over maqāṣid or maslaha. But I'd suggest that it's precisely the Shafis' commitment to grounding the law in textuality that makes their legal theory one where maslaha is read through the text, such that barring ijma' in a question, the proper interpretation of a text is one that takes benefit seriously. The other point worth contemplating is that if Bin Bayyah is right and maqāṣid has always been at the center of the law, what does this tell us about modern Islamic substantive law? How does it undercut the validity of most scholars who have misunderstood what Islamic legal theory truly is by giving excessive attention to textuality? Finally, can you tell us a bit more about the relevance of Bin Bayyah's theory? Who listens to Bin Bayyah? Who clashes with him? Why is he someone whose ideas deserve to be grappled with and understood? What are the stakes in giving him importance today? And also, how does he resemble or depart from other thinkers of using the maqāṣid paradigm? It seems to me that Bin Bayyah wants to remind readers of what the Islamic legal tradition was, rather than to elaborate a theory of maqāṣid in the ways that someone like Ibn Ashur or others have wanted to do. I think the answers to these questions can be foregrounded at the beginning of your paper and can strengthen the relevance of your topic. Also, just I'll conclude with a bit of perhaps structural advice. It might help your reader understand the two muqaddimat or the two muqaddimah that you present by providing the types of examples that you give at the end during those sections, because they're extremely dense sections. It's very theoretical, and I had trouble following what exactly Bin Bayyah meant. So it might be useful to provide examples in those instances, in those sections of the paper, because the parts of the paper that were clearest to me were those at the beginning, tracing the history of usul al-fiqh according to Bin Bayyah, and the section on the examples and your critiques at the end. So I'll leave it at that. And thank you again. It's a really good.
Thank you very much, Yusuf, Sufi, for those very helpful comments, both constructive and I think very practically relevant in moving the paper forward. Rizart, you have 5 minutes if you like.
Thank you very much. Normally in 5 minutes, a lot to unpack. Thank you very much, Yusuf, for all the advice. I'll take them all into account in revising the paper and structuring it, also reviewing some of the statements that I do or explanation about bin Bayyah. Now, I don't know, I tried to take some notes where you were writing, so a little bit. So regarding the examples and the idea that at the end of the examples, I said that bin Bayyah offers them as a proof to show that the Maqāṣid are the usul al-fiqh, the heart of usul al-fiqh, and like soul to the body. And I said that this seems a little bit far-fetched in the sense that, at least in the examples that you mentioned, they are called to duty only when the so-called textual analysis or textual procedures of usul al-fiqh fails. And you mentioned rightly that, as also bin Bayyah mentioned, that most of the illah, ratio legis, is also Maqāṣid itself. And you mentioned that many scholars do not need to actually explicate that because that is understood intuitively by itself, as you mentioned the case of wine and the analogy of wine being prohibited. Now the issue is that for bin Bayyah himself, this taken for granted analysis of Maqāṣid in the analysis of usul fiqh itself was not, he didn't perceive it as necessary to prove the relevance and the importance of Maqāṣid. So he had to come with these 33 ways that, if we see correctly, they are all masail of ikhtilaf. So they are all issues that are about ikhtilaf on the nas. So he mentioned in the paper, I have mentioned more detailed examples, but each example is like the Hanafi says that and the Maliki says that. They had this misinterpretation, they had this ikhtilaf about the text, and then Maqāṣid stepped in for one of the other madhab and gave the, let's say, a meaning or clear meaning, make possible the tarjih. So it is here that he highlighted more. So he brought this example in this context, right? And to show that without Maqāṣid, you cannot go to usul, because without the heart, you cannot be the body, etc. And I found that those examples, despite the fact that many scholars have made recourse to the Maqāṣid explicitly to resolve some complicated issue, still, at least for bin Bayyah, still they do not prove that the Maqāṣid is the heart, but the textual consideration and all those classical usul fiqh is the way the mujtahid goes, and then when he's stuck somewhere in a specific issue, he make recourse to Maqāṣid. And that seemed to me that his examples do not completely prove his points, but I have to review it and to see it more concretely. Then you mentioned the important topic of subjectivity of usul al-fiqh, and the idea that, and the scholarship on it, and how usul al-fiqh was not meant to be kind of manual that you follow with all the dawabit, like in the very mechanical way. And that is true, but I have noticed that somehow bin Bayyah is writing to an audience which conceives usul al-fiqh in precisely this way. So usul al-fiqh has an aura, kind of publicity, if you can say, of being objective, clear cut and everything. And Maqāṣid have a bad reputation of being subjective, etc. And bin Bayyah himself, in his analysis of usul al-fiqh, does not approach usul al-fiqh from this perspective, that is in its foundation is in a subjective, left to the rational consideration of the scholars, and despite his appearance is not as precise as it claims to be, but rather he goes through this. So he takes this reputation of usul al-fiqh to be objective and precise, he endorses it and tries to make Maqāṣids similar to it. So, and in the paper that I didn't mention here, as you might have read, he also gives some dawabit for Maqāṣid, how to make the Maqāṣid objective. So what I will argue is that although the scholarship, and I should engage more maybe with the Western scholarship and Muslim scholarship on usul, have highlighted the subjective aspect and and all that what you mentioned, bin Bayyah himself does not buy into it, or let's say he does not present usul as that, and builds his own project on this idea of the grounding Maqāṣid in a kind of usuli rigor. The rigorosity of usul al-fiqh, is also part of the Maqāṣid part of it, etc., etc. So that might be also interesting to highlight better in my paper. I think there are other points, but I think I surpassed my time. I don't want to take too much time. I will take them all in consideration. Thank you very much again for all your feedback.
Thank you very much, Rizard, for this. Again, a really well done and dense presentation that really speaks to the heart of the problems that our symposium is supposed to highlight. An excellent feedback, Yusuf. In fact, Rizard, we'll come back to this toward the end, right, with open questions and answers. I'm sure that this issue will come up, but Sherman Jackson's paper that Yusuf referred to was really inspired by an American legal realism, critical legal realism movement. So it's really an outside reevaluation, if you will, postmodernism in legal theory that makes very bold claims, which would be foreign to typical jurists who does see usul al-fiqh in the way that you described bin Bayyah as seeing. So I think this would be a really good point of intersection with Western scholarship, but an awareness of what modern scholarship and these schools, critical legal realism, are bringing. Our next presentation is by David Drennan. The topic is Al-Muwafaqat in Mauritania, Maqāṣid al-Sharīʿa and Mauritanian commentators on al-Shāṭibī at the turn of the 20th century. David Drennan.
Thanks. Let me just share my slides and then we'll get started. All right. So first of all, thanks to everyone who's made this symposium possible, the organizers and of course the participants. The papers have been fascinating, so I look forward to hearing the rest of them and learning more from everyone who's presenting. So, okay. So to begin, my topic's perhaps a little bit different to those that have presented thus far, in that I'm focusing on the historical reception of texts and contextualizing the place and standing of their authors, rather than engaging in the principles and discourse surrounding the kind of application of Maqāṣid. So this is because my main aim is to show a slightly different perspective on Maqāṣid, one that sees it integrated within the existing usuli intellectual tradition, rather than increasingly stepping outside of it, as has happened since the early 20th century. So first of all, a brief overview of the kind of standard narrative we've all heard and even probably taught regarding Maqāṣid in our classroom environment. So it's often claimed that Muhammad Abduh revived this once dead science of Maqāṣid al-Shari'a. His students, in fact, have explicitly acknowledged his influence on them in investigating and publishing in this area. It's generally noted in a kind of response to a narrative of stagnation and decline due to taqlid, requiring ijtihad to make Islam compatible with modernity through focusing on its spirit rather than the letter. And this, it's said that Abduh revived by discovering this lost branch of knowledge through his own unearthing of the Muwafaqat of Shāṭibī. So what I attempt to demonstrate in this paper is that far from being lost, Shāṭibī's text and contribution to this discipline was essentially alive and actually a living tradition. So not merely at the time of Shāṭibī himself, but continued through the works of his students and later scholars. And it was, in fact, both contemporary to and slightly preceding Abduh's discovery of this, as my current focus on the Mauritanian Maliki jurists, i.e. scholars within the method that Shāṭibī himself belonged to, hopefully demonstrates. So as we're probably all aware, Shāṭibī's Muwafaqat was printed for the first time in Tunis in 1884, which is approximately 500 years after his death. Now, even back in my undergrad days, learning of Islamic Law 101 and its history, this was one of the key areas of concern for me. It was 500 years. What happened between those two periods? And regardless of where I looked and what I read, it's not something I could ever find an answer to or even probe more deeply until recently. So kind of with that in mind, and as a kind of larger methodological background for framing my presentation and research, we have to bear in mind that the act of editing and printing these types of texts has never been kind of accorded any role in the writing of histories within our field. Works kind of appear out of nowhere for us to use as if they're from the ether or something like that. So likewise, the process of writing commentaries or super commentaries, so shuru al-hawashi, on texts rather than writing standalone works, has been little discussed in our field until very recently. So for example, most commonly brief mention is made of a rhyming abridgment of Muwafaqat by one of Shatibi's students before jumping to Muhammad Abdu, Rashid Rida, and the likes of Ibn Ashur or Abu Zahra in the 20th century. So on opening works related to the development of Maqāṣid, we find statements such as, quote, I did not find anyone after Shatibi who conducted independent Maqāṣid research until Ibn Ashur came, end quote, which rests on a number of assumptions. Not least is the fact that absence of evidence does not mean evidence of absence, as hopefully we shall see in the rest of my presentation. And this type of quote, symptomatic of the trend. Both Western academia and much of the research in the Arab and Muslim world largely relegates any texts which are not judged to be independent research to basically mere footnotes, at least the closer we get to the modern period. So, studies of the pre-modern period commonly make use of these as primary sources. So, however, it's this area that's crucial, as it's where we find an organic Maliki approach engaging Shatibi's work and the theory of Maqāṣid from the 1800s and early 1900s via both abridgments and commentaries on his work and that of his student, Abu Bakr ibn Asim. So this is within a wider discourse in our field that is looking at the commentary tradition and its role in the wider Islamic intellectual heritage. Okay, so begin talking about Abu Bakr ibn Asim, who's well known to anyone who studies the Maliki method. So he was the Qari al-Jama'a in his time, and he studied under a number of important teachers, including Ash-Shatibi. So Ibn Asim had a number of important students who later became scholars in their own right, such as al-Mawaq, whose commentary in Mukhtasar Khalil in fiqh remains a mainstay of the Maliki method to this day. People still study it. His brother Abu Yahya ibn Asim, who predeceased him, was actually considered the inheritor of Shatibi's thought and works and is noted for his responses to those scholars who criticized Shatibi. So, and as anyone who knows who's looked into the history of Shatibi's life, he received a considerable amount of criticism from some of his students even, as well as his peers. Numerous writings have been attributed to Ibn Asim. He's most widely known for his work on judgeship or qada with his Tuhfat al-Hukam. And among his excellent works are two rhyming texts in Usul al-Fiqh and an abridgment of Shatibi's Muwafaqat, which are the main concern here. So these are all mentioned in biographical notes about him, but have received little attention academically. Ahmed Raisuni notes that Ibn Asim refined and summarized Shatibi's text, whilst another of Shatibi's students, he literally says Talamiz Akhir, made a rhyming version of it. So this seems to have been based on the comments of the modern editor of Shatibi's published fatwa collection, whilst earlier authorities such as Ahmed Baba at-Timbukti in his Nail al-Ibtihaj explicitly note that Ibn Asim's abridgment is a rajis or a rhyming text like his other works, including the Tuhfa. A recent commentary on this text based on its single surviving manuscript in Spain gives 10 pages of the introduction to authenticate its direct attribution to Ibn Asim, wherein the commentator notes the similarities between Nail al-Muna and Ibn Asim's other well-known text on Usul al-Fiqh, which is known as Murtaqal al-Wusul, both in terms of the content, but also the structure and the vocabulary used. And it's this latter text that I'm concerned with here. So Ibn Asim's Murtaqal al-Wusul is considered one of his later texts, and it's the shorter of his two rhyming usul texts, having only 850 lines compared to the 1,000 in the former. He places a section on Maqāṣid al-Shari'a near the beginning of Murtaqal al-Wusul, occupying 27 verses of the 850 total. He places it between his discussion on the different categories of rulings, such as talking about the azima and rukhsa and so on, and the discussion of legal responsibility or taklif. So this placement shows that although Shatibi is known to have been criticized by authorities in Granada in his time, the principles of Maqāṣid that had developed up until his time, and also via his own work, were placed into the wider context within Usul al-Fiqh by Ibn Asim. They were not treated as a radical break with the existing legal theory or the legal schools. So as far as can be ascertained at this time, neither of Ibn Asim's Usul al-Fiqh texts received any older commentaries based on existing manuscript evidence, even though they're all noted under all the biographical information in dictionaries tarajum about him until the present. So that is until the late 18th century, a full century before Muhammad Abdu rediscovered Shatibi's Muwafaqat. So I mentioned Muhammad Yahya al-Walati, who died in 1912 in this talk first, rather than in my paper where I mentioned him last, basically just for flow. And this is because he's the linchpin connecting between the past and the present. So both Hamad Allah al-Ghalawi's commentary preceding Walati and Muhammad Fowles afterwards, that I'll discuss shortly, are indebted to him for posterity. So either mention of its made and aspects are included in Walati's own work, or the commentary after Walati builds upon it and interacts with his writing. So Walati comes from a noted ulama family from the town of Walata in southeastern Mauritania, which has a noted madrasa system dating back over 400 years. In his time, biographical dictionaries note that if you're talking about Walata and use the title al-Faqih, then without exception, Muhammad Yahya al-Walati is intended. And he's widely known in the region due to his expansive range of written works, as well as his 7-year journey for Hajj. And he actually wrote a travelogue called the Rihla al-Hijaziyya, all about his journey and what happened on the way. So Walati is routinely given numerous accolades and titles, as I'm sure we've all heard, al-Alama, al-Usuli, al-Fahama, and so on. And he's even called the seal of the verifiers, so Khatam al-Muhaqqiqin. His range of texts is prolific, but his major focus is in the related realms of usul al-fiqh and legal maxims, so Qawaid fiqhiyya, ranging from the novice level text to the most advanced in the Maliki method. So of note here is that he wrote his commentary Fath al-Wadud on the well-known Maraki al-Saud, which is the relied on latter-day text in Maliki Usul al-Fiqh. He completed it in 1872. He then wrote Bulugh al-Usul, his commentary on Ibn Asim, completing it in 1874. So both of these were actually published within his lifetime in Morocco in 1910, a couple of years before he passed, edited by Muhammad Habibullah al-Shinqiti, who's a well-known hadith scholar and was later based in Al-Azhar for the latter part of his life. So Walati also wrote a commentary on the versification of the Warqat of Imam al-Juwayni, a detailed rhyming text and commentary on the legal maxims of the Maliki school, as well as a commentary on Sahih al-Bukhari. So in other words, he was quite prolific in his output. It was actually via my ongoing research on Walati that a curious note piqued my interest at the beginning of his commentary on Ibn Asim's text. So in listing the sources that he relied on in his own commentary, Walati states regarding a text known as Qura, that it is not ascribed to anyone, but I think it's from Abdullah ibn Ahmed ibn al-Hajj Hamad Allah al-Ghalawi. So the editor of Murtaqa al-Wusul, the recent edition of it, notes that it's perhaps the earliest commentary on the text, though it's now lost, besides the mention of it and contents preserved by Walati. As Ibn Asim's text was restricted and mostly taught in the madrasa system in Mauritania via sessions of listening, because it's a rhyming text rather than via commentaries. So Walati also notes beside that he uses the Qawaid of Abi Ishaq al-Shatibi as a source. So a text on Usul al-Fiqh by this name is nowhere to be found in any of the biographical literature for Shatibi. However, Ahmed Baba Timbukti mentions in relation to him that he has derived, set down and verified legal principles, i.e. Qawaid, and the commentary of Maraki al-Saud by its author, Abdullah ibn al-Hajj Ibrahim al-Alawi, who died 1818, explains the term muwafiq in one of his verses as meaning qawaid. So at this stage, you can kind of posit that Walati here is referring to muwafaqat. And I note this because Walati then mentions that he relies on both the Qawaid of Shatibi and the Mukhtasar al-Usuli of Ibn al-Hajib, but does not have them with him. He literally says he doesn't have them with him when he's writing this commentary. So he transmits what's conveyed by Abdullah, i.e. al-Ghalawi, in what he transmits from them, basically if Walati agrees with them. So at this stage alone, Walati tantalizingly hints at the possibility that Shatibi's Muwafaqat was known in Mauritania by 1794, if not before, almost a full century before Muhammad Abdul became aware of its existence. So when we begin analyzing the text itself, this becomes even more apparent. So this part I've added since the submission of the paper. So noting here that I'm in the early stages of my doctoral research, technically first semester, first year, my preliminary analysis shows that Walati is directly quoting from Muwafaqat at numerous instances throughout the text, not just when discussing Maqāṣid, but also in the other areas that Shatibi's text actually covers, such as discussing ahkam, discussing qiyas, especially regarding tahqiq al-manat, which was previously mentioned in regards to Sheikh bin Bayyah, and so on. So sometimes it's solely a direct quote, but in other cases, it's intermixed with a summary of Shatibi's discussion. So a paragraph or two might be subsumed into a sentence or two, which at this stage, I can only assume was undertaken by Hamad al-Ghalawi in his earlier work and reproduced by Walati, because he basically just says Qala al-Shatibi, so as if Shatibi is saying it. Walati places the quotes and summarization of Shatibi's points in a surrounding discussion of the topic with other standard Maliki luminaries in usul fiqh, such as al-Qarafi, Hululu, and Ibn al-Hajib, as well as other established sources such as As-Subki's Jama' al-Jawami', of which Waraki al-Sa'ud is kind of seen as like a Maliki rendition of it. So, as stated earlier, there are two other commentaries on Ibn Asim, one prior to Walati that he draws on, and the other that builds upon Walati's own work. So I'll just give a brief overview of these to kind of place him in the wider context. So the first one is Abdullah ibn Ahmed ibn al-Hajj Hamad al-Ghalawi, who died in 1794, according to the biographical dictionaries. So he's listed as a scholar par excellence, and it's noted that in the Haud region of southeast Mauritania, there was no one like him in his time. He produced a number of texts across all major areas of Islamic learning. He was noted as having, a high station in every discipline. If he gave a fatwa on an issue, it was accepted by the community, is what's recorded. So a text on usul fiqh mentioned in the biographical dictionaries, but without any further details as to its contents or its kind of provenance. So one of Hamad al-Ghalawi's main students was his nephew, Muhammad al-Nabigha, who died 1829. He was a noted jurist and legal thinker, and he's pretty much central to Mauritanian jurisprudence. He wrote an important text on finding the mu'tamad, or relied on opinion of the school for issuing fatwas. According to the Maliki source, is known as the Butahiyya, which is still a mainstay for the madhab, even outside of that particular region. In it, there's a section on juristic preference, i.e. doing tarjih based on benefits or masalih and preventing harms or mafasid. And this again shows how it was a standard attitude in Maliki usul al-fiqh, and all of this was used within an existing framework. After that, we skip forward a bit to Muhammad Fal ibn Baba ibn Ahmed Bayyah al-Alawi al-Shanqiti, who died in 1930. So he's what, again, all of these guys are polymaths. It's incredible to see what they've written on. He was, a noted jurist, Sufi sheikh, and a historian. His Sharh of Murtaq al-Wusul is one of the things he's most well known for, followed by other texts in legal theory and aspects of Maliki fiqh. And he's also noted. He has a Takmila fi al-Tarikh, which is covering recent Mauritanian history and biographical entries. And actually, it's a major source for the history of the region during the late 1800s and early 1900s, particularly. So it's interesting to note here that Ahmed Mazid al-Jekni, the Mauritanian editor of Ibn Asim's Murtaq al-Wusul, summarizes this text by stating that Muhammad Fal uses his discernment to explicitly link Murtaq al-Shatibi's Muwafaqat, and other time, connecting it to the other Usuli texts as well. He also notes that Muhammad Fal stays very close to the structure and content found in the commentary of al-Walati. Now, since submitting this paper, just noting, I've actually located an edition of this text, but I think it may have literally been stuck in the Suez Canal. So I'm eagerly awaiting its arrival so I can actually do more analysis on it. Until then, I'm kind of just stuck with that interesting description. So this section is given an outline of 3 thus far little known Mauritanian commentaries on Ibn Asim's Murtaq al-Wusul and their authors, in order to show that the reception of Shatibi's ideas on Maqāṣid and Maslaha by his students' works was standard and not something that needed to be introduced to the region. And that's unlike the Islamic East, relatively speaking, where Muhammad Abdu and his students were all active. So all 3 authors, al-Ghalawi especially, predate Muhammad Abdu's students popularizing Shatibi's Muwafaqat, and 2 of the commentaries on Ibn Asim also predate Abdu's rediscovery of Shatibi in Tunis. So with the time that's left, I'll turn to the Mauritanian works on the Muwafaqat directly. So the next full print of Muwafaqat was in 1923, so with multiple other editions continuing until today. But to date, there's been no detailed study surrounding any of the abridgments of Muwafaqat or their commentaries. And as mentioned before, they've been relegated to mere footnotes or sentences, brief sentences. So the first one is by Ma al-Aynayn al-Qalqami, who died in 1910. And he's mostly known in the literature as an anti-colonial resistance leader against the French and Spanish forces, as well as due to his Sufism. He had a very large Sufi network in the region, but there's been little said about his intellectual output. So like the previous mentioned scholars, he was from a scholarly family, and there's been praise heaped on him of all sorts of things. He's recorded as having written between 100 and over 300 separate works. He undertook the pilgrimage to Mecca in 1858 and returned to Mauritania the next year. So he basically missed out he was 25 years early in visiting Tunis compared to when Muwafaqat was printed. But he did actually establish relationships with the elites in that region, and he established a Zawiya in the south of Morocco where he could begin teaching students, and it was also used as a base for his anti-colonial endeavors. And this is where he began producing texts for teaching. So Ma'al-Aynayn notes he first received a copy of Muwafaqat in 1889, so shortly after it was printed, and he wrote a rhyming abridgment of it that was completed in 1893. And he was later asked to provide explanation due to its complexities, which he called al-Murafiq al-Muwafiq. He completed it in 1905. So a detailed analysis of the contents of this needs to be completed. And again, it's early days in my study yet, but it's worth noting here that the text was printed in Fez during his lifetime in 1906. So the editor of the current edition explicitly states that it's the best of the abridgments, and that's by the early 2000s when this edition was published, and that he removes unnecessary digressions and provides clarification regarding Shatibi's terminology and overall stays close to the original text. The editor does note that there's sections where Ma'al-Aynayn mentions many Sufi escapades and fables, I mean, naturally due to his Sufi background. I'm circling back to Muhammad Yahya al-Walati in his later work in Shatibi's Muwafaqat here. So we saw in the previous section that in 1874, Walati was aware Shatibi had a text that he referred to as Qawaid, and noted he didn't have it in his possession. We also know he went on this famous Hajj pilgrimage that took about 7 years. And in his own account, he was gifted Muwafaqat around 1897, so shortly after the original printing of it in 1884. So his commentary on the Muwafaqat remains one of the largely unmentioned texts in standard biographical entries. The text was published under the auspices of his grandson, but thus far only 2 volumes have been printed, corresponding to the end of Kitab al-Maqāṣid in Shatibi's text. So in this work, he focuses solely on clarifying issues, literally tawdīḥ al-mushkilat, while summarizing aspects of the text. Now, similar to Ma'al-Aynayn's approach, Walati summarizes the text and provides illustrative examples to help explain complex areas and topics. However, it's not a linear commentary by any means, unlike Ma'al-Aynayn. He also provides his own opinions when he feels they're needed, although deeper research needs to be undertaken to understand the exact nature of the relationship between Walati's approach to Maqāṣid and Shatibi himself. It's clear that both Walati and Ma'al-Aynayn subsume Muwafaqat within the intellectual world they're already part of, and engage with Shatibi's work as part of the ongoing legal discourse. This is substantially different in approach to those who came after Rashid al-Rida, especially up until the contemporary period. This is because Maqāṣid was a standard topic of treatment within Usul al-Fiqh according to the Maliki tradition. It was already discussed in 1874 in Walati's commentary on Ibn Asim, and we can even see the familiar tripart division of Maqāṣid and its treatment of the 6 universals and so on. Way back in 1800 in the commentary on Maraqi Saud. So my point here is to show that engagement with Shatibi was a continuation of existing legal thought and not a radical break with what came before. And just looking at the time, so I'll conclude here. So as you can see, my brief paper is aiming to show a neglected area of historical research in terms of understanding Maqāṣid al-Sharīʿa and Islamic thought. It posits and hopefully at least begins to substantiate that Shatibi's work and ideas were known in Mauritania through the commentary tradition before Muhammad Abdu rediscovered the Muwafaqat in Tunis, leading to an explosion of research and work from his followers, which we all know about until today. I included a brief diagram there to try and give a timeline to show that there was a lot of activity between when Muwafaqat was printed in Tunis and when it was reprinted in Egypt by Abdul's students, as well as the connection through Ibn Asim before that. So I'll just finish there because I'm just looking at the time. All right, so thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, David. This was really, really fascinating. And it's also fascinating to see how it tracks so well with Rizart Bika's presentation. So we're fortunate to have Rizart, in fact, as commentary to your paper. I'm sure that a lot of what he found in Bin Bayyah will resonate and vice versa. I think that you two should talk afterward. So Rizart, please, floor is yours, 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Shabir. Thank you, David, for the fascinating paper and for all the work that you have done, which is like impressive, especially given that you are at the beginning of your PhD, as you said. I actually don't have more than 5 minutes comment. I will have some questions that I think that if you take them into consideration, or if they are possible for you to take them into consideration, might enrich your paper. First of all, as far as I read the paper and your presentation, listen to your presentation now, I think that your main point that Shatibi was not lost, let's say like this, until Abduhu found him and made his work proliferate in Egypt and all the other areas of Islamic world. That point, I think you have convincingly proved that that is not correct, or at least is incomplete, because really from what you have mentioned and what you have also explained, Shatibi thought was part, or at least Mauritanian tradition of legal thought and usul al-fiqh in various ways was incorporated in the Maliki tradition. And I think that's a great point in itself. Is like a great thesis, and it's worth it to write something on it. And then you have done also a great job in tracing the genealogy of Shatibi thought in the Mauritanian Maliki legal tradition, as well as I said, presenting to us the Maliki tradition of Mauritanian, which is Mauritania somehow is a kind of neglected area of great scholarship, and you have done that with introducing some names, erudite scholars in relation with Shatibi normally, but that's great. Now, to come to my question, as I said, my comments are very short, is like you mentioned that immediately after Shatibi through Abu Bakr ibn Asim, there was a kind of continuation of Shatibi thought, and that was transmitted. And then there was a kind of gap until a little bit before and the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, when you have tracing the scholars that have incorporated Shatibi thought in their, or commented or make digests of his thought in his writings. I know that it's impossible sometimes to do that, but if there is any explanation for this kind of middle gap between the, let's say, immediately after Abu Bakr ibn Asim and then the taking of this lineage at the late 19th, early 20th century, if there is an explanation of why so, that would be great, although that is not always possible. But the most important thing is like that when I was reading your paper, I was thinking, you mentioned these scholars use Shatibi, and they sometimes commenting on it, and sometimes make mukhtasarat of it. What I was wondering is like, what is the purpose they are doing that? Are they taking Shatibi thought for reformistic purposes, like did Abduhu and the modernist later on? What was somehow missing in the paper is like, what is the place of Shatibi in the overall thought of these scholars? So these scholars are usuli scholars, are mujtahid, or are like erudite. How they are utilizing Shatibi is like Shatibi thought, reformistic thought, and original contribution to usul al-fiqh through Maqāṣid, taken and developed and used for specific circumstances in which they were writing, or it was naturalized in the Maliki fiqh and somehow domesticated, and it became part of the stream of Maliki thought without actually prompting any reformist movements, like it happens with the modernists, etc. That will be great, just to take a look at the work of the scholars in its wider scope and see why they are using Shatibi and what is the reason and how. And if Shatibi his thought was domesticated and put in, naturalized with the Maliki traditional thought, and the revisionary aspects tamed, that would be great, also highlighting how they do that. How did they do that? To take Shatibi and tame his thought and put it in line with the general stream of Maliki legal thought. Another question that came to my mind when I was reading your paper, your great paper, is that, okay, I already covered somehow this. Okay, then when the Shatibi thought was spread in the Muslim world through the writings of the modernists, Abduhu, Rashid Rida, and Ibn Ashur and other scholars, I don't, how was received in Mauritania? Did it reach Mauritania? And once these scholars or their students received Shatibi interpreted in the modernist lenses, and according to modernist thought, did they had any reaction to it? Did they reply to it? Did they notice that there was different from what they received? So was there any interaction between the thought, the Shatibi reinterpreted by the modernist and the Shatibi known in the Mauritania? Was there any interaction or criticism or whatever once this modernist thought reached Mauritania, if it reached? I'm not familiar with Mauritanians. And then, so how did they respond to it if they really received modernized fashion? And then the last one is actually, so your paper prompted me to think of Bin Bayyah as a kind of Mauritanian scholar that for Bin Bayyah, Shatibi is also very, very important. And he makes sure to interpret Shatibi in a way that at least rejects the, let's say, hardcore modernism, if we might say like this, you know, and bring Shatibi as a traditional classical scholar, as an embodiment of the traditional usul al-fiqh. And through his thought, yeah, this is the case of Bin Bayyah, for example, through Shatibi thought, by presenting him as a traditional usuli, like the epitome of the traditional thought, he tries to bring a reformist movement or a reformist proposal. But Bin Bayyah normally is late and is not part of your span, but it helped me to think about Bin Bayyah in this sense. So thank you. This was some of the questions came to my mind while I was reading your paper. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Yes, David.
Let me see if I can address some of those briefly. Yeah, so I mean, the whole explaining the gap thing is, I mean, it's something that's vexed me for probably close to 10 or 15 years when I started learning Islamic Law 101 back in the university undergrad time. So I think at least at this stage I can push it back to potentially a century before Abdul. So that's like 100 of the 500 years almost at the end that I've kind of taken care of. I'm still trying to trace if that text, the original text that Walati quotes, is available in manuscript. I mean, as you know, this type of research takes time. So I'm hoping that we might find something there. But either way, I would probably look at how Walati is actually quoting and making use of the earlier text as a way to show that continuity there. Now, the examples regarding Shatibi being a kind of reformist spirit or more integrated, my feeling at this stage that hopefully I'll be able to substantiate in the fuller article due to the increased word count, is that his discourse was actually more integrated into the Maliki Usul tradition understood in that region. Definitely the authors that I've mentioned, they give numerous examples within that, and basically the way they marshal their kind of sources, if you like. So rather than just using Shatibi all the time, they bring in other sources like al-Qarafi and so on and so forth. So it shows it's kind of like he was integrated within the wider discussion that was happening. So that's my feeling at this stage, and hopefully I'll be able to dig a bit deeper on that. I like the term you used, the domesticated or naturalized use of Shatibi. I thought that was actually quite apt, because my feeling is that at least there was an aspect of the wider Maliki tradition that he was always that. Of course, he had criticism regarding things to do with his notion of bid'ah and so on, and that's why he was criticized in Granada in his time. But after that, I'm hoping I can find out more regarding how his thought was kind of used outside of that reformist lens, if you like. Now, in terms of the Mauritanian, the modernist lens of Shatibi reaching Mauritania. Now, I did focus on turn of the 20th century, so it was before that time. There have been a number of other abridgments and so on of Shatibi's Muwafaqat by Mauritanians up until the present. Sheikh bin Bayyah is one example who's engaged with him, but there are also others, including the equivalent of like the Grand Mufti of Mauritania at present has written an abridgment of Shatibi's Muwafaqat as well. And there's been some all the way through. Now, my feeling is that most of these, of course, you're going to be aware of the currents that are happening in the Muslim world. I mean, some of the Mauritanian writers explicitly state that, while Mauritanians and Moroccans, for example, are aware of everything happening in the Muslim East, the Arab East, if you like, people in the Arab East don't know anything about the West. I think you still kind of find that dialectic taking place. And yeah, so it's something that I'll see if I can bring into my further research. Again, as I said, I'm only first year of that period, but definitely these are great for me to consider kind of going further down the track. So thank you for your feedback. I appreciate it.
Excellent. Thank you very much, David, for your paper. And we are fortunate that both of you are part of the symposium. And I think that this conversation going forward will really be very fruitful for the field of Maqāṣid studies in general. I was just part of the dissertation committee of Tasneem al-Kiq's paper at Georgetown, who wrote on the concept of darar in Maliki law and contrasted it to historically, not just in the 20th century, to the same concept in the Hanafi law. And there, this contrast between the East, Islamic East and the Islamic West was very clear. And particularly in the 20th century, reform movement actually was relying on the Maliki norms of divorce and darar harm, proving harm to wife, and therefore reforming, quote unquote, the largely Hanafi-based legal system. Here, the Maliki law, how it is brought in. So Tasneem al-Kiq, especially in her last chapter, looks at that. People like Muhammad Abu Zahra and others wrote basically how the Maliki tradition is seen as too liberal by the largely Hanafi system, even after the reform, this reformations, if you will. And I wonder if there is something similar going on with Muhammad Abdu's discovery, quote unquote, of muwafaqat. So very interesting dynamic. Our third presenter is Yumna Hilmi, and her topic is Maqāṣid Discourse from Islamic Modernism to Theorizing Authoritarianism. Yumna Hilmi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Umair and Dr. Sharīʿa and everybody behind the scene and all the attendees. Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen. Yes, as Dr. Umair has mentioned, my presentation would be about the Maqāṣid discourse from Islamic modernism to theorizing authoritarianism. And as we all know, that's a brief covering to the historical background of the Maqāṣid discourse. Maqāṣid Shari'a refers to the higher objectives of Sharia or the Islamic law, which are aimed to promote public benefit and preventing potential harm. Interestingly, the studies of Maqāṣid Shari'a have been based on various phases of development. They are either traditional, which is roughly between the 11th and to the 15th century, or from the late 19th century onwards. For the traditional approach, it features scholars like Imam al-Juwayni, al-Qarafi, al-Ghazali, al-Shatibi, and it is mainly based on the 5 objectives of Sharia, namely religion, life, offspring, and intellect, and property or wealth. These scholars or this approach focus on the idea that the maqāṣid or the objectives of Sharia are extracted from the text through the process of induction and not deduction, and that it is connected actually to usul al-fiqh and does not constitute a source of law in its own. The second approach to Maqāṣid al-Sharia is the modern approach of Maqāṣid, which is started by the Ottoman jurist who, by the late of 19th century, who proposed for new objectives of Sharia or more objectives of Sharia that are to be compatible with the downfall of the Ottoman Empire in order to promote modernization, in order to stop the downfall of the Ottoman Empire. This conversation that started by the Ottoman jurists continued among the scholars and reformists in Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, and Syria. The most significant feature of this approach, the modern approach to Maqāṣid, or the Maqāṣid-oriented approach, is that it proposed that Maqāṣid should be independent of usul al-fiqh, as speakers before me have mentioned, and it's to be made into a new scientific discipline. Scholars of this also era, or this approach, proposed new objectives and priorities of Sharia, such as freedom of thought, equality, justice, human rights, social orders, all as objectives of Islamic law. Some of them have even, like Rashid Rida, suggested that Maqāṣid approach should be used without any traditional limitations related to usul al-fiqh. After this era, or if we speak about the contemporary scholar or the second generation of modernist reformers or Maqāṣid al-Shari'a, these scholars also expand the scope of Maqāṣid, that it should be beyond, again, like the first generation of reformers, that it should be beyond the objectives of Sharia by highlighting the public benefit and well-being. They reject literal reading of sacred texts or spiritual resources. They expand the application of the objective to be reinterpreted the Islamic law in light of the modernist values, to ensure that they remain compatible with the modern realities or modern context. They adopt notions like, especially after the Arab Spring, I would argue, scholars like Al-Qaradawi, Tariq Ramadan, Jasir Ouda, Ahmed al-Raisuni, Abdullah bin Bayyah. Many of them have, some of them have introduced notions such as democracy, justice, human rights in the socio-political order. Maqāṣid al-Shari'a, the second generation or the contemporary generation of Maqāṣid reformers, unlike the first generation, they actually promote or support or encourage positive relation between the Muslim world and the West. However, such encouragement or such promotion for the idea of positive relation with the West does not mean, it is believed that it does not mean that the Maqāṣid-oriented approach necessarily result in a compatible adoption of the Western values or Western policies. One of the interesting research that I came across is Halim Ren study that he conducted in 2010, where he interviewed political Maqāṣidis or political actors who adopted Maqāṣid approach as in their political policies in Turkey, Malaysia, and I think in Indonesia. And he concluded that the only issue that causes a lot of debate between the contemporary generation of Maqāṣidic reformers and the West was and still the Israel-Palestine conflict. However, it seems that with today's with Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayyah's politicization and use of the Maqāṣid discourse, it seems that this is not the same anymore. Employing the Maqāṣid-oriented approach as a tool to bring about legal change was and still debatable. Technically, the debate is about the constant increase of the objectives and the priorities of the Islamic law from scholar to another. In which basis can these objectives be prioritized and reinterpreted when a conflict arises between them? To what extent may this reinterpretation and prioritization of Maqāṣid affect the authority and the credibility of the theory? Can it make it, turn it into a tool in the hand of those with contradictory ideological, social, and political inclinations? And what is the most acceptable methodology to apply the Maqāṣid-oriented approach without being subject to certain agendas or scholars' subjectivities? These questions were the motive behind this paper that aims to address how the Maqāṣid discourse has been politicized in light of the recent declarations and fatwa by Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayyah concerning the UAE normalized relation with Israel and the UAE policies against regional democracies. My argument is that Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayyah's prioritization of Maqāṣid and reinterpretation of Maslaha were deeply rooted in the Maqāṣid discourse and the rational reasoning related to the contemporary Islamic modernism and not the traditional discourse. In brief, Abdullah bin Bayyah, as Bika mentioned before me, he is a prominent Mauritanian Maqāṣidi who was born in 1935. He is a well-recognized politician as well as a jurist in both the Middle East and the West. He has worked with various Arab government and media, and his fatwas and declaration are considered authoritative. Bin Bayyah was previously deputy head of Union of Muslim Scholars, which was headed at that time by Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. However, he resigned his post shortly after the military coup in Egypt in 2013. Abdullah bin Bayyah is the founder of several initiatives, including Muslim Council of Elders and Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Society, which both are funded by the UAE. Recently, Abdullah bin Bayyah was appointed as the chair of the newly established UAE Fatwa Council. As a background of bin Bayyah's latest view, it's important to know that most of his ideas, political ideas, are associated with the Arab Revolution and post-Arab Spring world. Bin Bayyah's alliance and relation with UAE also reflects many of his political positions and views regarding regional democracy. In an attempt why it's before I mention this, why it's very connected to the post-Arab Abdullah bin Bayyah's position is very connected to post-Arab idea or post-Arab Spring is because after the Arab Spring, the UAE has attempted to counter the change occurring in the region and hinder the ongoing call for democracy as it's reported and researchers have concluded. It appears that the UAE believe that such transformation would challenge the country's status quo and possibly stimulate the reformists to oppose its rigid policies. Therefore, the UAE has promoted political actors and Muslim scholars to prevent such transformation from occurring. In an attempt to theorizing his political and philosophical foundation of his discourse, Abdullah bin Bayyah initially attempted to explain the challenges and the reality of Muslims today in his book تنبيه المراجع على تأصيل فقه الواقع. Abdullah bin Bayyah is very concerned and occupied with the idea of واقع, and not only واقع, he is actually interested in the idea of التوقع, the expected reality, the reality and the expected reality. According to Abdullah bin Bayyah, the condition of Muslim Ummah in the current era is characterized by two extremes. The first is a modernist subjective call that seeks an imitated product, which is here he meant democracy and Western value, and adopt very flexible rational approach where the ends justifies the mean. The second extreme is the traditional and religious call that ignores the modern contextual reality and does not allow any modern interpretation and implementation of Islamic law that would resolve the challenges encountered in the Muslim era. However, Abdullah bin Bayyah's view to democracy and political opposition is a negative one-sided view. According to Abdullah bin Bayyah, the Arab Revolution were motivated by Western values that contradict Islamic principles. He opines that Muslim modernization and reformers have confused the values of Western democracy with those of Islamic ones. Bin Bayyah argues that the Western values of democracy are based on, according to him, on the Hegelian model, which promotes the idea of destruction for reconstruction. Based on Bin Bayyah's assumption, he concludes that the Western model of democracy opposes the Islamic principles of maslaha, or promoting public benefits and preventing harm. At the same time, in his book Tanbih al-Maraja, he also criticized the call for reviving the Islamic tradition, and he asserts that such recreation endeavors are impractical effort to revive what he calls an imagined past. So it's critical to understand these 2 points before understanding how did Abdullah bin Bayyah use the Maqāṣid discourse to justify all of these thoughts. According to Abdullah bin Bayyah, he defines Maqāṣid as the spirit of Sharia that is derived from the fundamental resources of the lawgiver, as well as those attained by ijtihad or intellectual reasoning. However, in contrast to the modernist reformer, Abdullah bin Bayyah, as the speakers before me have mentioned, Abdullah bin Bayyah believed that usul al-fiqh and maqasid are interconnected and cannot be separated. So he is actually inclined to support traditional jurists like al-Ghazali and al-Shāṭibī, who suggest that discipline of Sharia but is not independent of it. In order to theorize his thought, Abdullah bin Bayyah constructs his idea in supporting autocracy on two main ideas. The first one is the prioritization of Maqāṣid al-Shari'a. As we mentioned earlier, the modern approach of Maqāṣid, or the reformers and modernists, suggests that or focus on introducing new objectives and new priorities and prioritizing between them new objectives that that Sharia recognizes and aims to achieve at various levels. Abdullah bin Bayyah's proposal is constructed on this idea of prioritizing the Maqāṣid and introducing new Maqāṣid. He argues that the maqsad, or the objective of peace, is more important and higher in rank than the maqsad of justice. In one of his statements during a speech, at the opening speech of the Forum of Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies that was in Abu Dhabi, Abdullah bin Bayyah stated that the value of peace has priority over the value of rights. This statement illustrates that despite bin Bayyah's traditional understanding of the theory that we mentioned, he follows al-Shāṭibī, the theory of Maqāṣid, he actually does not reject the modernist rationale for introducing new objectives. Rather, he modifies and repurposes and reshapes their approach. So we can see here that he acknowledges the maslahah of preserving human rights, the maslahah of preserving justice, but he also contends that this maslahah contradicts the importance of maintaining peace and social stability. So therefore, he now argues that central values like human rights, justice, and freedom need to be sacrificed in order to establish peace, and there should be a prevalence of the maslahah of preventing revolution and any opposition against established ruler. In other declaration, Abdullah bin Bayyah, applying the concept of maslahah, Abdullah bin Bayyah argues that the Muslim society in the Middle East are not yet ready for a democracy, and that any call for democracy in such a situation is actually a call for war. His assertions here serves as a reminder of the false dilemma that we all heard, me or chaos, ana aw al-fawda, echoed by many authoritarian rulers in the region, beginning from Mubarak in Egypt, al-Assad in Syria, Zain al-Abidin, all of them actually. The problem is, the use of maslahah here by bin Bayyah to maintain authoritarianism may not only result in graving injustice and inequalities, rather it also shows that he perceived the Muslim nations to be under a legal emergency status. However, he made no suggestion about when it will be possible to restore the state of normality. When will the Ummah go back to a normal state where they can claim justice or rights? Abdullah bin Bayyah here used the vocabulary of avoiding war in his statements, in his book, Tanbih al-Maraja, and remaining in obedience, which also inherited from the historical rhetoric of Dawlat al-Khilafah and Dawla al-Sultaniyya. And in fact, it's interesting to mention here that the traditional Salafist discourse, a strand of them, not all of them, a strand of the quietist Salafist or Salafist discourse used this exact period as a constant reference against revolutions and against opposition of the ruler. However, Abdullah bin Bayyah reintroduces such discourse in a new modern approach, namely Maqāṣid al-Shari'a. Despite his claim to the contrary, Abdullah bin Bayyah does not offer another political approach for the modern political system that he rejects. Rather, he promotes the long-held principle of classical fiqh, which states that rebellion against the ruler should be prohibited and that there should be no opposition against the ruler, or la khuruj ala al-hakim. Once again, this kind of principle was what perceived as the highest Islamic principle in fiqh al-siyasat al-Sharīʿa by the Salafist and the traditionalists in the region, who determines citizen-ruler relationship based on the literal interpretation of scriptural resources or hadith Fa'at Wali al-Amr and hadith al-Bayyah and so on. On the other hand, when we look to the modernist approach to Maqāṣid, we will find that their scholars distinguish between the passive rebellion and the armed insurrection. They argue that the legitimacy of rebellion is profoundly linked to the motivation behind him, to the legality of the ruler, to whether they are just or not. All of these contributes to the legality of the opposition. So not every khuruj is prohibited. Nonetheless, Abdullah bin Bayyah interpretation of maslaha expands the prohibition of the opposition to include all kinds of revolutions and rebellions. So it can be argued that the use of Maqāṣid approach here by Abdullah bin Bayyah alters actually or shifts the rulership in the modernist theory, transforming it from a conditional legal relationship that could be ended or revoked to a paternal relationship that is natural and unchangeable. It also shifts the theory's emphasis on the priority of justice, rights, democracy, and giving priority to and legal backing to preventing opposition and maintaining authoritarianism. Although Abdullah bin Bayyah's view seems to be that peace can be only attained through authoritarianism, it's important also and it's fair to note that his previous interviews before the Arab Spring and books that were published before the Arab Spring suggest the exact opposite. For instance, in his book, Culture of Terrorism, Abdullah bin Bayyah regards justice and good advisory governance as significant approach of seeking solution for political conflict, and he suggests that justice can be attained through justice. However, most of these views on the importance of justice have changed after he became allies with the UAE. The second idea that Abdullah bin Bayyah construct his thought on is the idea of tahqiq al-manat, which is a very important concept in the field or the realm of usul al-fiqh. Following the announcement of peace deal between the UAE and Israel, Abdullah bin Bayyah, as a president of the Emirati Fatwa Council, affirms that the international relations and treaties are amongst the actions that fall within the policy-making specialization of the ruler. Although this declaration appears to be related to pre-modern discourse or the Salafi discourse, whereby only a ruler have the power to make treaties and with foreign powers and formulate public policy, the declaration, however, again adopts the modern approach of Maqāṣid. How is this connected to tahqiq al-manat? Abdullah bin Bayyah's understanding of tahqiq al-manat or definition, he has his own definition also of tahqiq al-manat that is based on the concept of reality, as we mentioned, that he is occupied with the understanding of the reality. He defines tahqiq al-manat as a deep diagnosis of the reality or of the waqi' to understand the legal cause behind the verdict and subsequently apply it to the current context. So he suggests that there are three major elements and problems in the waqi' or the reality of Muslim today. Number one, the failure of identifying the reality, or the failure of identifying the impact of the reality on the verdicts or the ruling, and the failure of recognizing the proper methodology to deal with such reality. In his book, Tanbih al-Maraja', again, Abdullah bin Bayyah raises the question of who has the authority of tahqiq al-manat, of verifying the legal cause or the reality. To answer this question, Abdullah bin Bayyah attempts to reinterpret the concept of ijtihad, or what's known as independent reasoning, human reasoning in Islamic law or Sharia law. So he reinterpret the concept of ijtihad by classifying it into three groups. The first is ijtihad in issues concerning individual, whereby they are left to them to decide whether how to practice their faith based on the lay person or individual's verification of their own reality. He illustrates with the example of an ill individual who determines whether they are too sick to fast during the month of Ramadan or not by themselves. You don't need a jurist or a judge or a scholar for this. A second type of ijtihad, according to Abdullah bin Bayyah, is regarding newly emerging issues such as financial transactions, which are supposed to be referred to specialized committees. And the third ijtihad related to duties of what he calls a Sultan al-Akbar. He actually calls it like this, a Sultan al-Akbar, the grand ruler. These include the declaration of war, peace treaties, and governance, which should all be left exclusively to the ruler. Accordingly, it seems that Abdullah bin Bayyah advancing an an anti-jurist approach. We don't need a jurist anymore. If the individual will judge for themselves and newly emerged issues will be referred to a specialized committee. Similarly, jurists should not be consulted in any legal or constitution where during the ruler's decision making. This is because, according to Abdullah bin Bayyah, jurists do not understand the full reality or the implication of certain decisions, nor do they know the ruler's hidden motivation, which could be difficult for them to understand. Now, there are many problems with this Abdullah bin Bayyah's discourse. That although that he addresses the questions of why we need to identify the reality and who had the authority to identify the reality in his book تنبيه المراجع على تأطير فقه الواقع. One of the limitations of his explanation is that it does not address the question of how the reality should be dealt with. On the other hand, in one of his fatwa that is published on his website, and also it is in the book of علاقة أصول الفقه بالمقاصد, Abdullah bin Bayyah acknowledged that there are one of the major methodological defects that have resulted in significant crisis in the Muslim world is the use of text without paying attention to the spirit of Maqāṣid and the Maqāṣid. He further argued that such methodological defect occurs in three different stages: the stage of ta'wil, textual interpretation, which deals with the text, with addresses the question of what is the verdict, and the stage of ta'lil, rational reasoning, which addresses the question of why based on the Maqāṣid Shari'a, and the stage of tanzil, the application, which answers the question of how should the verdict be applied based on the contextual realities. Interestingly, Abdullah bin Bayyah suggests that the ruler has all-inclusive authority with regard to policymaking and taking decision on political relations. However, once again, he does not attempt to identify the qualities of such ruler, which qualify him or them to deal solely with the three stages of ijtihad, ta'wil, ta'lil, and tanzil, nor does he address their legal duties or the process of their appointment. So Abdullah bin Bayyah's approach, therefore, has failed to verify the legal cause or identify the reality. Another problem is that despite the fact that Abdullah bin Bayyah's lectures and books highlight the importance of fiqh al-waqi' or fiqh of reality, his argument actually overlooked a lot of the dramatic transformation and changes that have occurred to the political structure that transformed it from a sultanic state to the modern nation state, and from an individual's rule to the rule of institutions. Another problem is that the modern Maqāṣid-oriented approach was mainly developed by Islamic reformer and modernists who introduced new branches of fiqh, like fiqh al-aqalliyat, fiqh of minorities, fiqh al-waqi', fiqh of realities, fiqh al-ma'alat, fiqh of results and consequences. They employ the modern nation state and its requirement at the basis of modern law. They argue that the state's legality is determined by the will of the nation, including its jurist, and not by the ruler solely. However, Abdullah bin Bayyah now uses the very same methodology and means for the opposite purpose. To conclude, why Maqāṣid? Even though Abdullah bin Bayyah adopts the modernist model of Maqāṣid and certain elements of Maslaha discourse, his elaboration reflects many of the, as we mentioned, quite Salafist thoughts. One may pose the question regarding why bin Bayyah decided to use the modern approach of Maqāṣid to present his traditional thought that support authoritarianism, if the result of his assertions, like those of the quite Salafists who promote strict obedience to Muslim rulers and silence of political matters, then there is a question of why bin Bayyah did not simply justify his thought using the traditional doctrine and the long list of texts that we have on hadith, again, the hadith of the Ta'at Wali al-Amr or al-Bayyah or the absolute obedience, and all of these, why he decided to use such discourse. Indeed, it could be difficult to understand these traditional political viewpoints by a jurist who proposed the understanding of the reality and the modern context. However, we could conclude that regardless of the quite Salafist unconditional support to the ruler and their opposition of any type of rebellion, they appear to have become more defensive and marginalized after the uprising at the Arab Spring. A likely explanation is that their doctrine is possibly rigid and incapable of adapting the notion of religious moderation, which the UAE is trying to sell to the West. However, the most appropriate approach for the UAE or narrative for the UAE is the Salafist traditional narrative, which guarantee absolute obedience and prevent rebellion. While so UAE takes or Abdullah bin Bayyah takes the very same approach and reshaping it in the modern framework of the Maqāṣid-oriented approach, which promotes the UAE's image and credibility in the international relations. To conclude, just final thought, with the ever-increasing number of the Maqāṣid and the constantly changing priorities and the absence of the appropriate guidelines, one may argue that the Maqāṣid-oriented approach has become an ambiguous feature. This paper argues actually that the ideological utilization of the Maqāṣid discourse can shift the theory's objectives from its purpose-oriented basis to result-oriented and utilitarian reasoning. This may result in its misapplication or misuse or abuse by different ideologies and agendas to achieve different outcomes. And indeed, Abdullah bin Bayyah's subjective interpretation and prioritization of Maqāṣid-oriented approach to satisfy utilitarian objectives could result in the failure to effectively reform the legal theory. And yeah, that's it. I'm sure I took more of the time that was dedicated for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Yumna Hilmi. This was a really rich presentation, but also very poignant. You pointed out some very serious theoretical and practical concerns with Maqāṣid and its uses and abuses today. Our commenter is Muhammad Mahdi Ali. Mahdi, take it away. You have 10 minutes.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you, Yumna, for your presentation and your wonderful paper. I really enjoyed reading your discussion about the evolution of the concept of Maqāṣid and the politicization of the Maqāṣid discourse. The questions you pose in your paper regarding how scholars prioritize certain objectives over others and what to do when such prioritization results in counterintuitive results is a pressing one in today's geopolitical environment. For one, the list of priorities is seemingly limitless. Who is to decide what priorities make the list? What factors merit consideration when putting together the list? What do we do when these priorities go explicitly against the text of the Quran or positions that have been unanimously agreed upon by Islamic jurists? These sorts of considerations are coming to light with the 21st century developments in the Maqāṣid discourse. In the West, it has become increasingly fashionable to talk about Maqāṣid and its potential for promulgating laws based on Western principles of human rights, and is especially popular when discussing the fostering of East-West relations. This is again because of the apparent flexibility of the concept, with various reformists and scholars adding whatever they feel is important to the list of priorities that must be taken into account when formulating Islamic laws. As Yumna mentions in her paper, the term became especially popular in connection with the Arab Spring among people across the entire spectrum of Islam, believers, fundamentalists, secularists, and even non-Muslims. Here was a historical moment that everyone could get behind, and the term Maqāṣid captured the spirit of the movement, which desired change in order to improve the human condition. For this reason, it is fascinating that for bin Bayyah, the end result has been completely inverted. As Yumna notes, though the Maqāṣid-oriented approach has been used by many reformers to articulate the various forms of democracy by Islamic modernists, bin Bayyah repurposed this approach to support modernist authoritarianism. Yumna argues that, number one, he uses the subjective prioritization of the Maqāṣid of Shari'ah to legitimize and justify autocratic policies, and two, applies old jurisprudential themes that were crystallized during the period when the caliphate was in existence. With dictatorial regimes in the Arab world continuing to hold onto power, religious figures that put forth anti-democratic ideals couched in modernist Maqāṣid discourse are doing a disservice to the world's Muslims. The way that Abdullah bin Bayyah uses his platform to endorse certain political ideologies is dangerous because it demonstrates that the pre-modern Islamic tradition can essentially be used by any ideologue in support of his or her cause. Yumna says that this means that bin Bayyah believes Arab countries are in an emergency legal status. Under this view, bin Bayyah believes that peace can only be achieved through authoritarian rule. I think this is a very charitable interpretation. I would go so far as to say this is an insult to the intelligence of Muslims. As you note, bin Bayyah conflates multiple discourses to achieve his ends. It is a form of neo-traditionalism that results in dubious adherence to both the rich Islamic tradition and the modern discourse on human rights. While governments may be buying the rhetoric, it is quite transparent to the people who are reading what he says. And the backlash is already apparent. For example, bin Bayyah has been removed from a prominent Islamic conference in the West, and many other journalistic and academic articles critical of his actions continue to be published. Thank you, Yumna, for your wonderful paper examining the evolution of the Maqāṣid discourse and its use by neo-traditionalists to invert the results and purposes intended by modernists. Before I conclude my response, I wanted to jumpstart the discussion with a few questions. Number one of your central arguments is that the UAE is promoting and co-opting bin Bayyah's work because of the image it is trying to sell to the West, which is that of peace and modernism. My question for you is how much of the co-opting of this framework is to sell an image to the West versus to bolster internal legitimacy with its own people? That is to say, do you have a sense of whether people in the UAE or perhaps other Arab countries are taking his discourse seriously? Number two, do you have a sense whether in his legal and religious discourse, bin Bayyah engages with the modernist reformers who have come to opposite conclusions? What does this interaction with other modernists look like? And number three, my third question is regarding the argument made by bin Bayyah in Tanbih al-Maraja. So am I understanding correctly that his understanding of ijtihad, the jurist basically is playing no role? Because it appears in your paper, he's saying jurists cannot comment on the matter of individual faith, nor on the matter of governance. And in newly emerging issues such as financial transactions, are those specialized committees also not jurists? So what role are jurists playing? Is it really no role at all? So those are my three questions.
Thank you very much. Yumna, if you would like to respond, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mahdi Ali, for your profound and insightful feedback. Thank you so much. With regard to the bin Bayyah engagement with modernist scholars, bin Bayyah actually was a very great friend to Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, one of the greatest modernist reformers of the Maqāṣid discourse. And I would argue that, I'm not sure, but I would argue that yes, he has his relations with he is fully aware of the modernist discourse, and he has his positive relations with modernist reformers, at least before the modern or the Arab Spring or 2013, because as I've noticed through his publications and his lecture, that most of his discourse have changed totally after 2013. With regard to the concept of ijtihad, well, he defined the ijtihad from different angles, as Bika has mentioned before me, but his reinterpretation of ijtihad here is regarding the idea of who has the authority to verify the legal cause. So he is suggesting that since certain types of incidents or certain types of verdicts are to be left to other people other than the jurists, like individuals or like newly emerging issues, Abdullah bin Bayyah argues that similarly, ijtihad is in the political, or let's say in the policy making, are to be left solely to the, or exclusively to the, it's from his ikhtisas, specialization of the Wali al-Amr or as-Sultan al-Akbar. You asked a question before these two, but I forgot to note it. If you remind me, please, Mahdi.
Yeah, I was asking, you had mentioned in your paper about the UAE selling this image to the West about peace and modernism, and I'm just wondering how much of it is, also an argument for its own people versus just for the West.
This is a hard question to answer. It goes to the anthropology and the anthropology of the people in the UAE and the Gulf. It's hard to answer on behalf of a whole people. But I would say that let's talk about the Muslim Ummah or the Muslim nation, which I perceive that they are against his views, even though he is a very well-respected and prominent scholar. But from an anthropological point of view, people of the Gulf usually follow and support their rulers, and they are behind them in whatever what. So, but we cannot give a generalized opinion like this. It's difficult. It's unfair. UAE is not only trying to sell a good image to the West, but it also try to promote itself as a predominant controller, or to take the lead from, let's say, Saudi Arabia, which promoted the Salafi discourse before the current era, which promoted the Salafi discourse that is supporting Wali al-Amr or the established ruler, and I would argue that the Maqāṣid discourse that support autocracy and authoritarianism will be the main or the backbone for authoritarianism in the region, and will replace the traditional Salafi discourse that was based on hadith or the textual resources. This is my prediction, let's say. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. So thank you very much to all the three presenters and the three commenters. Those who commented, please be sure to email your comments to the presenter within a week if possible. Any questions? The floor is now open for any questions. There is one question that I see already, and let me read it out. This is to Rizard Becca. The comment says, Jazakumullah khairan for your presentation. My question is, could you provide a practical example of a legal ruling derived using bin Bayyah's call for tajdeed? I'm trying to see how and what he's mentioning is different from what already is mentioned in classical usul.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Normally, bin Bayyah, as I said, he is speaking about three kinds of ijtihad. One is ijtihad fi dalalat al-alfaz, and he has a book on it, on the terminology and Hanafi terminology and the rest of ulama. Then he has this ijtihad fi usul al-fiqh, that he has a book on it, إثارات التجديدية في حقول الأصول الفقه. Then there is this third aspect or third kind of ijtihad, that is ijtihad بتحقيق المنات. And in the majority of the examples that bin Bayyah gives or try to, is actually in this third type of ijtihad, for which he has written another book that was mentioned before, تنبيه المراجع في تحصيل فقه الواقع, if I'm not wrong. And so practical example. Now, what he have so many in the future. The question is that I'm trying to see how his mention is different from what already is mentioned in classical usul al-fiqh. So what he comes with the new idea. For example, he did the as the previous commenter mentioned, is the idea of he uses his ijtihad for the idea of democracy. If is democracy the right thing to do or not, or is other thing, and he goes and uses tahqiq al-manad to say that whoever calls for democracy in this time is calling actually for war. Then he has the revival of the Covenant of Medina, which you of him have written also a paper on it, as a way as a new ijtihad, by saying that whatever is included in the classic usul al-fiqh regarding the jizya or the submission of the Ahlul Kitab is actually circumstantial, which doesn't mean, it means that the original Islamic principles are those contained in the Covenant of Medina, where you have a multiplicity of equal communities that united to a dustur, to a constitution, that live together, in harmony. And then when that failed, not because of the Muslim, historically speaking, in the time of the Prophet, but because of the animosity of the other communities, then as a response to the circumstances came all the ahkam, or all the rules connected with jizya and jihad to the kuffars and Islamic Caliphate and the Ahlul Kitab and everything. Then Bin Bayyah says that given the reality of today, we are in a position to reconstitute that original Islamic intended vision of politics, or call it as you want. And then he uses the Covenant of Medina to bring it as the main framework to build the new rules on the other religions and Muslim communities, etc. For example, that might be one example, right? Important example in which he uses his tahqiq al-manat idea and maslaha, etc., to reconsider and to historicize to a certain degree the classical ahkam on Ahlul Dhimma and the rest. And then he has other issues on the democracy and other issues connected to a lot of questions. But one example, I think, these examples I mentioned might be something, a kind of novelty that he is proposing by putting the Covenant of Medina as the original intended asl of the Islamic relationship with the other religions, and historicizing all the verses and the hadiths of the Quran by rendering them circumstantial and not foundational. That comes to my mind now, for example, as a way that classical usuli will not recognize that kind of thought, I think. I'm not sure though.
Thank you very much, Rizart. This is a really significant issue, of course, but I think you were quite modest in your description of it, because if what you were saying does indeed represent his actual thinking as opposed to a political move, he has effectively cancelled all fiqh. There is absolutely nothing public that's left, whether it's jihad or ahkam of Ahl al-Dhimma or ahkam of jizya, and I mean, everything is gone, right? Nothing is left if you go back to
everything is, the other parts are valid as long as the circumstances require it. So it's not abrogated in the sense of, removed. It's just that what is the intentional meaning? The original meaning or the intention, it is the Constitution of Medina. And then if circumstances require, then somehow you have already in the scripture a clear path how to respond to that. But in modern time, globalization is a new opportunity to reconstitute what during the classical time, the pre-modern time, was not possible to to do. That's pretty much it, as far as I've understood him.
Interesting. I believe there were questions by Sharuk Naguib and David Drennan. We can go in that order. And Yusuf Sufi after that.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum. I just want to thank all three speakers for three wonderful presentations, which together are a perfect lineup for any panel in terms of moving from a close look into the methodology, to the intellectual history, and then to the contemporary political context. So in a way, they are a specialized set of papers within a special issue, as it were. And they all draw or compare ways in which muwafaqat has been used. So that was really fascinating and very learned papers. I have a question to Dr. Bika. It's a straightforward one. I couldn't get from your paper the extent to which bin Bayyah draws on the muwafaqat in order to create that interconnection between usul and maqāṣid, and especially when you started to talk about the examples of al-kulli wal-juz'i, al-Shāṭibī has a long discussion drawing on Quran hermeneutics, but actually on the intersection between usul and ulum al-Quran, where he talks about al-kulliyat wal-juz'iyat wal-ijmal wal-bayan. So I wonder, whether you really looked into the degree to which bin Bayyah draws on in his different methodologies or stratagems to bring together usul and maqāṣid on al-Shāṭibī himself. So this is one question. To David Drennan, it was very exciting listening to your paper, because I have a very similar experience in a different field of knowledge, which is again related to the Quran, but specifically balagha or ilm al-balagha, where I have found that within the 19th century, there were this narrative about Muhammad Abdu rediscovering Abdul Qahir al-Gurgani's Dalā'il al-I'jāz and Asrar al-Balagha, and that there has been this 600-year gap between what Muhammad Abdu has revived and the tradition of Balagha, especially in connection with I'jāz al-Quran. But when you look into the biographical and bibliographical material, you find connections in different regions or different parts of the Muslim world, which show continuities, especially through the Hashia genre, Hashia ta'liq and ta'liqat and shuruh. So I wonder whether you've looked into the Hashia as a way of developing intellectual history. There is the work of Margaret Larkin on Hashia, as well as Khalid al-Ruwayhib. And I can share some of my thoughts on Muhammad, the narratives about Muhammad Abdu and why they have come about. But if you do trace the genealogy of the works, you will find where the links have been. So my question to you, you've presented the reception history, and it was very learned and very clear. Whether you have managed to also note shifts in the debates that this intellectual history reflects. So these hawashi often have constitutive problems. They are not just, word by word, as they are doing the commentary on the text itself, on the matn itself. They also, in a way, engage in ongoing conversation on particular problems that arise from the matn. So I do wonder whether you've had any look into these kinds of debate that arise in the hawashi and the shuruh that you've looked at. To Yumna Hilmi, just want to thank you for a fantastic paper. I think it just gives us a sense of the wider context in which these technical and intellectual debates are happening. Okay, thank you.
So it seems that Rizart, the questions, Rizart, if you could answer Dr. Sharūkh's question and then ask you. Actually, if I may ask David, because he had his hand up. What I would ask you to do, David, is either answer the question, if you will, and ask your question. Then it seems like you also had a question of your own, and then Rizart, if you could do the same, and then we'll go to Yusuf. Please.
Okay. So should I start first or David?
I think David.
Okay, perfect.
Because his hand was up.
Okay, sure. Sorry, so I'll ask my question first for Rizart, because he can respond after that to the previous question as well. So my question was regarding, has he actually looked into any of Sheikh bin Bayyah's fatwas found in Sina'at al-Fatwa wa Fiqh al-Aqalliyat, because he gives a number of detailed fatwa as ta'liqat of the fatwa from the European Council for Fatwa and Research, and he gives a number of really interesting examples there that would, I'd say, be quite different from the kind of classical understanding of a lot of these positions, such as a Muslim, a woman who's married, who becomes Muslim, but her husband doesn't become Muslim as well, and how that situation differs from the classical understanding, which is that the woman should be divorced. So he gives an alternative perspective on that, using a number of the kind of tools in his toolbox. So I was just wondering if he'd actually looked into any of those in terms of fleshing that out. And in response to Sharūkh's feedback, that was really wonderful, and I'm really glad that you actually brought that up. Yeah, I mean, exactly. So the Shurū' and the Hawashi are an area that I'm really interested in. At this stage, again, my research is in its very early stages. I do, tracing the shifts in the focus and debate and how these authors engage with the original text. I mean, that's basically something I'm looking to do. And I have some sense that they're engaging it as peers, basically. They're engaging with it and sometimes agreeing with Shātibi, sometimes disagreeing with him, sometimes adding other sources that they prefer, and so on and so forth. So I'm basically looking to trace that kind of wider debate and discussion to show that, again, as I said, it was something that was a live kind of discourse and so forth. So your point about looking at Balagha and so on, that was fascinating. So as I'm tracing the discourse, I'll refer to those sources that you mentioned, because that sounds great.
Thank you, David. Rizart, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. So to respond to the question of the use of Shātibi in bin Bayyah's project of reform of Usul al-Fiqh, in the paper I didn't mention it too much, because first of all, bin Bayyah has a book called al-Mashāḥid min al-Maqāṣid, and there he has a huge section of the book in which he deals with what is maqasid and what are the daruriyat and tahsiniyat and all the things, hajiyat, etc. And normally he draws from Ghazali, Shātibi to a great extent to explain what the maqasid are, what are the universal maqasid and what are the dependent maqasid, etc. Until from Ghazali to Ibn Ashur, he has a kind of analysis. And then at the end, he somehow gives a definition of his own, which for the moment I don't remember in its fullness. But Shātibi appears prominently in the book Mashāḥid min al-Maqāṣid as a way to explain the classical tradition on what maqasid is. When it comes to the actual proposal of Usul al-Fiqh, I mean to renew Usul al-Fiqh, their Shātibi appears also, but to a less degree. So I mentioned that bin Bayyah mentioned Shātibi in one of his points of renewal, that was taking into consideration the mutual attraction between universals and particulars. And he mentions that Shātibi has been dedicated to this topic. He also quotes quite extensively, given for the length of the book at least, from Shātibi. Then he says that the Shātibi has highlighted the importance of the interaction between universals and particulars, although he said at a certain moment, it seems that Shātibi seems to contradict himself stating that in a case of contradiction between a general rule, or qaida fiqhiyya, or general rule, and a particular, it is necessary to preserve the order, which means giving preference to the universal, because, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, sorry, I thought. Because that's the order. So the particular should be subsumed under the universal, and the universal should have precedence. Bin Bayyah here somehow criticizes Shatibi, saying that this, in a way, opens the door to the modernist, progressist way of understanding Maqāṣid and using the universal to undo the effect of the particular texts. And then he comes with his own, kind of review, adjusted notion taken from Shatibi, that in the case of a clash between a universal and a particular, neither of them should have precedence. It should depend from what this jurist is doing and what is the situation. And then by using the Maqāṣid, he will give one or the other. And then he mentioned how this process can legitimize istihsan, saddu dhara'a, and I don't know, maslaha mursala, etc. So he draws on Shatibi, and he also draws on Shatibi to criticize the modernist, like Abu Zayd's, Nasr Abu Zayd's, or this kind of modernist thought, by that, according to him and to Qardawi also, try to undo the particular of the text, or the text in the name of Maqāṣid. And then Bin Bayyah takes from Shatibi the idea of this interaction between universal and particulars to respond and to criticize the modernist approach towards Maqāṣid. Whereas when it comes to David's questions, that yes, normally Bin Bayyah in his Sinat al-Fatwa, and even in his book on Fiqh al-Waqia, even in the book Mashahid min al-Maqāṣid, in these two last books, at the end of the book, he has this called fields of application. And he divides them in political field, economic field, and aqaliyat fields, right? And then there he as you mentioned, he somehow applies what he have said in Mashahid min al-Maqāṣid, or in the renewal of Usul al-Fiqh. And he takes mainly from this European Council of Fatwa and Research, and tries to prove how the new realities have made it incumbent on Muslim to give ruling and precedent and fatwas that might not be recognized in the traditional fiqh, which is the fatwa that you mentioned, or the fatwa that I mentioned, or on the Constitution of Medina. But so pretty much this is the idea that he uses his theory to actually legitimize some specific positions that he needs for his political project. But what is his political project was not part of my paper. Was also, I was lucky that it was covered by Yumna, which means that all these theoretical proposals come to fruition with specific fiqh position that will legitimize his own approach towards fiqh. Whereas my question was directed to Yumna. She mentioned in her paper that Bin Bayyah somehow is endorsing a Salafi approach towards obeying to the rulers, and he's using Maqāṣid in a kind of modernist way, borrowing from the modernist. I was wondering, I was a bit about the clarity of the terms. For example, obeying to the rulers, is that really like a purely Salafi, Wahhabi, if we can say that notion? For example, Oveymi in his book on Ibn Taymiyyah has shown this kind of tradition goes back long time, from the beginning of the formation of Islamic schools of law, maybe, and is a kind of venerable tradition that is Bin Bayyah taking from Salafis, or is he really taking from the kind of neo-Sufi traditional approach? So, and then what does it mean that his Maqāṣid he's borrowing from the modernists? Because in his books he distantiates himself from what we might call the kind of progressive modernist, Nasser Abu Zaid and the French school, as he calls it, the other, I forgot the name of the person for the moment. He distances himself from them, and he claims that he's he distances himself from the liberals, let's say like this, and from the modernists, and he claims that his usul al-Maqāṣid thought is traditional, in line with tradition. So how do you define it being a Salafi thought, the obedience to the ruler, or the Maqāṣid is modernist? So where is the line? That would be great, and will help also us understand better the lines of the contemporary Islamic landscape.
Very good. So, Yumna, you have two questions that are kind of connected. So please take note of them. And at the end, after we take Yusuf, we're going to have, we're actually going to have Ahmed Khatib ask his question, which I think may also be directed to you. And then we'll come to you to respond. So Yusuf, please go ahead.
All right, my question is comment for Yumna as well. So Yumna, I enjoyed your talk. I wonder if you might want to extend your conclusions beyond what you call the politicization of the Maqāṣid to make a more general point about the inevitable limitations of all Maqāṣid models. It seems to me that what you show is that the Maqāṣid in theory, divorced from practice, is fairly uncontroversial, but that in reality, the world is a messy place. And the messiness of the world makes it impossible to divorce the Maqāṣid from political stakes. So in short, the Maqāṣid, like human rights, looks great in theory, but not in practice. Any thoughts on this?
All right. So Ahmed Khatib will go to you, and then finally, Yumna has now 3 questions stacked up.
Assalamu alaikum. Firstly, thank you, Dr. Becca, for answering my previous question. I was the one who had typed it out regarding a practical example of Sheikh bin Bayyah's usul. So thank you for that answer. It was very helpful. My question is for Dr. Yumna. First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very beneficial. My questions, subhanAllah, I think it was just mentioned right before me by Dr. Becca regarding the reference to Salafis a few times in the presentation. And one time, if I heard correctly, Salafist rigidness. And I wanted to just maybe ask what was meant by the rigidness of Salafis. Was it referring to specifically the doctrine regarding al-Khuruj al-Hakim, or did that extend to other positions regarding Maqāṣid and usul that they hold, since the conferences regarding Maqāṣid? So I wanted just to clarify what was that in reference to, and if it was the latter regarding fiqhi or Maqāṣidi or usuli positions that they hold, if you'd be so kind as to maybe mention some examples of those that you believe are rigid, and if they do, and why you believe or argue that they do not have legal precedent for them. And this ties in a little bit to what Dr. Becca just referred to as kind of the making this distinction between Salafism and traditionalism. And I wanted to maybe open that discussion up to, well, what is the reason for that distinction? Is the distinction based on theology, usul, Maqāṣid? What makes Salafism not part of traditionalism? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Is it my turn?
Yes, Yumna. So you have, I think, a few related questions. So address them as you like.
They are all connected. Thank you so much, Yusuf, Ahmed, and Becca. In fact, I will start with how would we differentiate that bin Bayyah distance himself from the modernist Maqāṣid. This is also and that his approach are actually of the modernist approach. This is a problematic idea. This is the problem is that he presents himself as a traditional jurist of Maqāṣid. He distanced himself from the modernists, and it's important to distinguish that not all modernists is like Muhammad Abu Zaid or hold ideas or thoughts like we had modernists who are like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, for example, or who are like Ahmed al-Raisuni. So, but the idea that bin Bayyah is distancing himself is the idea of disconnected maqāṣid from usul fiqh. This is, from my understanding, where bin Bayyah distancing himself from the modernist approach. However, it's not necessary that he says that I'm implying the modernist approach, but analyzing his declaration and analyzing his way of methodological interpretation of or thought, one would clearly conclude, I would argue that the idea of prioritization of maqāṣid, introducing new maqāṣid, is not from a traditional approach of the maqāṣid. It's from rather the modernist one. His new definition of tahqiq al-manāt, or his new understanding of ijtihad, also of the modernist one. I would argue that he would simply justify his thought instead of saying the scholar, the ruler only have the exclusive authority for legal causing or verifying the legal causes. He could simply use the same, the long-held tradition that is already applied and have already supported autocracies in the region for decades. Let's say Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and by the Salafists. I maybe need to clarify this more. It's not my opinion regarding the Salafi. I'm presenting it in the context of why UAE or why bin Bayyah here promoting his ideas or his thoughts through the framework of maqāṣid and not the traditional framework. This is not to insult the traditional framework, it's the opposite actually. But as the UAE now trying to promote something to the West and to promote a new discourse that should be implemented according to UAE, or try to implement in the region, that to replace the Salafist and the traditionalist discourse. If the Salafist discourse is rigid according to the West, and to UAE, they consider it rigid. Of course, UAE have supported Salafist before the Arab Spring for a long time to a limited. It was a limited support. Let's say it's not like how Saudi Arabia supported Salafist and benefited from the Salafist discourse. And it's important also to distinguish between the Salafist strands. Not all Salafists are the same. That's why I mentioned the quietist Salafist and traditionalist, because these two are usually criticized by the West. Therefore, it would be impossible for the UAE to seek to employ their discourse. This is my interpretation. The perfect way to do it is to borrow their narrative, not their rigid narrative. The rest of their narrative are considered by the West rigid, by the West. And for the UAE, the perfect idea is to borrow their narrative and give it a modern, brightful framework. Was there another question? So yes, the rigidity here is perceived by the West and by the let's say the autocracy, not by bin Bayyah himself. Bin Bayyah already a traditional scholar, and he presents himself as a traditional scholar. But when you look at his justification to the UAE policy, because he is now the representative of the UAE policies regarding the democracy in the region, and he puts himself in this position. The religious reference for the UAE's policies and new agendas. So he represented this way. Yeah, this is pretty much everything I can say.
I think, Yumna, there was a question by Yusuf of whether this is the very nature of Maqāṣid to be open to this kind of use. That may be something you want to comment on.
Yes, I would agree. I would argue that the problem is not just in the political discourse or politicization of Maqāṣid. This is just an example of where we arrived, according to my analysis, that this idea or this obsession with Maqāṣid actually, and leaving behind all the traditional and the rich heritage that we have for usul fiqh and for fiqh or Islamic law in general, and just focusing on this is what it meant to be, that the religion at the end, or Islamic law at the end, will be empty, will be just a very liquid. If I dare say that it gives a liquidity nature that it could fit anywhere. It could support any idea. It could be employed by different agendas, different extremes, if I may say, which is very dangerous to support different idea, very contradicting and very opposing purposes. So yes, it is the problem of the obsession with the Maqāṣid without being connected to usul al-fiqh, and trying to which I would also suggest that if someone would like to study or to conduct a study on the decolonizing the Islamic studies, I would put number one the idea of Maqāṣid, because it is not in general, of course. By the way, I support bin Bayyah in his ideas regarding the Maqāṣid and his thoughts regarding the Maqāṣid, but I criticize his application and his implementation because it's pretty much contradicts his thought. He himself contradicts himself, if I would say. Thank you.
Now, there was some reference to my work results. I wanted to, I guess, bring up a couple of points, partly to support Yumna's point about this modern aspect or modernizing aspect. But I guess before that, Yumna, if it would be helpful to differentiate perhaps between modernists and reformists. Of course, in the political rhetoric, people like Rashid Rida until Yusuf al-Qaradawi are called modernists by their opponents, but that's not something that they would accept. And in their own presentation, at least with Rashid Rida, Muhammad Abdu was slightly different, but especially with Rashid Rida, after the First World War, there is a very clear distancing from modernism, right? So Rashid Rida becomes, I don't think that he can be easily called a modernist. And certainly Yusuf al-Qaradawi on many things, right? So it's important to differentiate between Yusuf al-Qaradawi on the one hand and somebody like Hassan al-Hanafi or even al-Jabri, and people who are more systematically modernist. But also, in fact, I have an article where I differentiate between a number of Egyptian thinkers like Fahmi Huwaidi and Abu Karam and a number of this group that becomes prominent in the late 80s and 90s, who look like they're part of the same, if you will, political alliance. But I have an article called "Non-Muslim Citizens" that's available online if you would like to look at it, where I differentiate between how Qaradawi makes allowance for non-Muslim citizens versus how these what are called the New Islamists, TNI, the New Islamists by Raymond Baker in his book. I think it's who is afraid of Islamism or something, or Islam without fear. He describes this, and in my article, I differentiate between their positions somewhat systematically. In my view, these Islamists are what they are Republicans. They are nationalist Republicans, unlike Qaradawi, who still is trying to straddle traditional fiqh and making allowance for the nation state, but constantly confusing, perhaps purposefully, these terminology. So, for example, when Mursi was elected president of Egypt, he was calling him Imam of Muslims. Whereas these nationalists do not make this kind of conflation. They are, Tariq al-Bishri, another example, they are much more like conservative Republicans of the West. They're nationalists, and they, in a sense, accept secularism, but they want Islamic conservatism. And once you appreciate this dichotomy, I think it's much easier to place bin Bayyah as precisely a direct heir to this conservative republicanism and nationalism. You don't have to, of course, agree with me, but I think that it's good to make that that differentiation. Of course, also David Warren's new book is relevant to all of the three papers on this, both parallels and distinctions between Qaradawi and bin Bayyah. On the question of rebellion and against ruler, I think that it is not going too far to say that this was a position that modern quietist Salafism and Wahhabism popularized in the modern era, in the nation state era, meaning that, of course, it was late medieval orthodoxy, quote unquote, that developed after a late Mamluk period, which is very, which takes this position, which is khuruj al-hakim is haram, that you do not rebel against the ruler. But this was, again, this is a different world. And then in the 19th century, early 20th century, the Muslim world is a different place, much more open to protest and rebellion against colonialism and whatnot. So I think that this reestablishment of this position happens in Saudi, and to be precise, Saudi was not a nation state. So when the Wahhabi scholars are promoting this allegiance to the ruler, there is a categorical difference between the Saudi conception and Wahhabi conception of their mission, which is a religious mission, and it's not a nation state, it's not a secular project. What is new, almost radical, with bin Bayyah crowd is that they are transferring that position from a religiously based movement, which does not see itself as a nation state. It expands, if you will, its ideological borders everywhere, and its own citizens are not full citizens like Shia if they are not part, if you will, of the religious mission. So it's not a modern nation state. From that to bin Bayyah's mission, which is full embrace of secularism, and then applying the late the traditionalism and the model of complete ta'at wali al-amr to a secular state. I think that is the radical nature of this this transformation that we should appreciate. I do not see any more questions. Are there? Is any of the presenters or any of the audience, would you like to add anything at all? Oh, there is one. Okay. Yes, please, Dr. Sharīʿa. We can't hear you. I think you're muted. Sorry.
My apologies. I actually have a quick follow-up comment for David about reception history being, in a way, embedded in the debates. So if you want to understand the status of a Hashia, you need to relate it to the debates in which it becomes significant and important. So I'm looking forward to reading that aspect of your work. So this is a question to everybody, not just to the panelists. I'm not an usul scholar. I'm a Quranic studies scholar, but with literacy in usul al-fiqh, especially where it intersects with Quranic studies. But I fear that the way we're thinking about usul as a tradition, and then thinking about how it's being developed in contemporary context in Islam, is positing the text and its intellectual development in the past versus its development, the different developments today, textually, intellectually, but also within dynamic socio-political context. The missing link is how did Islamic law accommodate the diverse contexts in which usul and the application of the law happened in Malaysia, Bengal, Turkey, Egypt, North Africa, Al-Andalus. It couldn't have been this kind of methodological purism that we seem to reflect on the contemporary discussion of Islamic law, particularly in the context of Maqāṣid, when we're judging or assessing bin Bayyah as in Yumna's paper, on how, on the fidelity of his positionings, political positionings in light of his method, so to speak. So are we missing something? Are we reifying something here, especially when we're talking about the tradition and usuli theories? Is there a way in which we're seeing some patterns? I understand that modernity, we can speak of modernity from now until maybe a few decades later as, in terms of the trope of the rupture. But for historians who look both at intellectual history and social context or socio-political context, there are patterns that you see in terms of how traditions accommodate, adjust, and how practitioners of traditions are not always as faithful to their methodologies. So is really something extraordinary in what we're seeing in terms of the shifts and the, let's say, the insincerity in some of the applications and the way that the tradition is being divested sometimes of its coherence, as we've seen in some of the papers. This is a general question, and maybe we should leave it till next time, or tomorrow, I mean. So yeah, it's just a thought that has been building up.
David.
Yeah, I was just going to try and respond briefly to that great insight you just gave. So I think one of the things that I've noticed thus far in the symposium is it's very theoretical, and it's talking a lot about Maqāṣid and usul theory, but we have this issue of, well, how is it actually used? And one of the main issues that, relating to my area is that we have, for example, the huge fatwa collection of al-Mahdi al-Wazani in the early 1900s in Morocco, 12-volume text of fatwa that he's collected, covering about 400 years of North African Maliki history. And in some of those, they're multiple pages long, and he goes through the judicial reasoning process that the scholars went through over multiple generations in some of these cases, and you can kind of see how they use their preference. They do tarjih, they do all of these type of things to come up with a particular position on an issue. So of course maslaha and everything comes into that as well, right? So we can kind of see that. And I mean, I think what you mentioned about the fidelity to the theory rather than what may have happened in the reality is really quite interesting. And I guess that's always one of the issues. So I mentioned briefly a text called the Tahiyya, which talks about finding the mu'tabad in the Maliki school and using that for giving fatwas, essentially. So this is part of the training to be a mufti, for example. One of the aspects in there, of course, it mentions tarjih, it mentions all of these things, which are essentially a way of giving a preference to something that may not be immediately theoretically kind of viable based on a purely procedural understanding of things. So, I mean, I guess there's always going to be that tension, right? And as the other presentations showed, we have a kind of, the political reality and everything comes into effect with all of that as well, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think that's important to consider as well.
All right, very good. I think that I guess one incomplete thought I have on this question is that usul al-fiqh could be seen and has been posited by some as a language through which you talk about what it is that the jurists are doing rather than a method that they're following. But precisely, in other words, what we are engaged in is usul al-fiqh, in a sense, right? If we make it more disciplined and if we hold each other accountable to the integrity of some method, that is what usulis were doing. And politics was something that was always involved, but it had to be brought, it had to be disciplined. Yusuf earlier mentioned the article by Sherman Jackson where he speaks of how usul al-fiqh, and he happens to lie, I guess, having this Maliki background, he sees usul al-fiqh as much more fluid than some of the more formalist jurists do. So he considers usul al-fiqh as merely post hoc and simply a way of talking about usul. But and he gives this example of how al-Juwayni, again, Juwayni lived at a time when the Seljuks are fighting the Byzantines and have this great victory in the year 1071. He probably wrote this fatwa before that, in which he says that it is completely impermissible to employ Christians in Muslim in positions of power over Muslims, and this has been the standard old position, and so on. And the brunt of his critique is borne by none other than al-Mawardi, his great predecessor, who lived at a different time, just a generation earlier, when there was no such great sense of animosity or in immediate sense that our Christians may be disloyal and may be siding with the Byzantines and whatnot. And al-Mawardi says, for example, that there are two kinds of ministerial positions. There is tanfīz and tafwīḍ, and when it comes to tanfīz, merely application of some policy, then Christians or Jews, non-Muslims could be employed. What's interesting, what Sherman Jackson argues, is that this is completely based on a political judgment of what is good for Muslims, but the language that they're using is not political. The language they're using is, the Prophet says that, the Quran says that, but of course the Prophet and Quran have been the same for al-Mawardi to Juwayni. And what I thought, and this was partly my critique in my book, it came out of these kinds of observations, is that in the classical, starting already in the classical period, there was a suppression of political language in Islam, or rather what I call desiccation rather than suppression, that you have to talk about political questions in legal terms because legal language is all that's available to you. And because that's how jurists construct their authority. The jurist is not a political leader who can say that, well, I believe that it's really dangerous for Muslims to employ Christians and Jews in the administration at this point, given that we're fighting the Byzantines. Rather, you would say, Allah says never take the Christians and Jews as your awliya. And, so the language of law has to be timeless. So I think that those tensions aren't new. But at the same time, I think it's important, and I think that it has become clear in many of the presentations, is that there is a much stronger rupture in our contemporary situation When bin Bayyah, for instance, says that we can throw out all issues, including the issue of ijma' on the obligation of having a Muslim ruler and of Sharia and so on, all of those things are thrown out in, if you will, in a sense, as I argued in my earlier comments, that even the reformists haven't done. In fact, reformists are trying to revive a coherence. Right? They're trying to bring back some coherence, but in a sense that can work in a modern world. But what bin Bayyah's modern sort of modern traditionalism is doing is, in fact, completely, it seems to me, taking away the coherence of Islamic tradition, Islamic law, in a sense that reminds me of Alistair MacIntyre's comment, how a tradition dies. A tradition dies when it loses coherence completely, where its adherents are completely reliant on foreign references to make their points. And not because, so tradition dies not because it cannot solve rational or practical problems, but because its adherents do not, if you will, they do not care, or they find the reality perhaps that confronts them not amenable to the requirements and impositions of their tradition. So be that as it may, perhaps it is something new and extraordinary that we're living through, and it's worth thinking about.
Thank you. That was really helpful, and I'm not disagreeing with you. I just wanted to throw this out there so that when we're comparing with the tradition, we're not just considering the theoretical tradition, but the ways, the dynamic ways, or the dialectic between tradition and application, so that we can exactly understand how the rupture is happening today, not just in terms of lacking the fidelity, but also in terms of even in the messiness of application, to borrow Yusuf's word, the messiness has become too messy to sustain. So that's why it's important not just to compare theory, classical theory and its development, and contemporary failure to uphold the theory, or developing discourses without coherence. So if we understand exactly the different gaps between theory and practice in the past, and when we're assessing the discursive practices on usul or on maqāṣid today, we can diagnose how far we've moved away as compared to the historical practice, and not just to the theoretical formulation in the past. So I'm with you. I just wanted to provoke that kind of discussion. Thank you.
No doubt. Thank you very much, everyone. This is our time. Thank you for your patience and really, really incredible presentation and discussion that followed. Hopefully we'll see you all tomorrow. Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam.